subscribe, click on the bell, like, comment.
Preface of Alice of Old Vincennes by Maurice Thompson. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Céline Major. Alice of Old Vincennes by Maurice Thompson. Preface. To Monsieur Placide Valcourt, M.D., Ph.D., LL.D. My dear Dr. Valcourt, you gave me the inspiration which made this story haunt me until I wrote it. Gaspard Roussillon's letter, a mildewed relic of the year 1788, which you so kindly permitted me to copy as far as it remained legible, was the point from which my imagination, accompanied by my curiosity, set out upon a long and delightful quest. You laughed at me when I became enthusiastic regarding the possible historical importance of that ancient find, alas, fragmentary epistle. But the old saying about the beatitude of him whose cachinations are latest comes handy to me just now, and I must remind you that I told you so. True enough, it was history pure and simple that I had in mind while enjoying the large hospitality of your Gulf-side home. Gaspard Roussillon's letter then appealed to my greed for materials which would help along the making of my little book, The Story of Louisiana. Later, however, as my frequent calls upon you for both documents and suggestions have informed you, I fell to strumming a different guitar. And now to you I dedicate this historical romance of Old Vincennes as a very appropriate, however slight, recognition of your scholarly attainments, your distinguished career in a noble profession, and your descent from one of the earliest French families, if not the very earliest, long resident at the strange little post on the Wabash, now one of the most beautiful cities between the great river and the ocean. Following with ever tantalized expectancy the broken and breezy hints in the Roussillon letter, I pursued a will-o'-the-wisp, here, there, yonder, until by slowly arriving increments I gathered up a large amount of valuable facts which when I came to compare them with the history of Clarke's conquest of the Wabash Valley, fitted amazingly well into certain spaces heretofore left open in that important yet sadly imperfect record. You will find that I was not so wrong in suspecting that Émile Jason, mentioned in the Roussillon letter, was a brother of Jean Jason and a famous scout in the time of Boone and Clarke. He was therefore a kinsman of yours on the maternal side, and I congratulate you. Another thing may please you, the success which attended my long and patient research with a view to clearing up the connection between Alice Roussillon's romantic life, as brokenly sketched in Monsieur Roussillon's letter, and the capture of Vincennes by Colonel George Rogers Clarke. Accept then this book, which to those who care only for history will seem but an idle romance, while to the lovers of romance it may look strangely like the mustiest history. In my mind, and in yours I hope, it will always be connected with a breezy summer house on a headland of the Louisiana Gulf coast, the rustling of palmetto leaves, the fine flash of roses, a tumult of mocking-bird voices, the soft lilt of Creole patois, and the endless dash and roar of a fragrant sea over which the gulls and pelicans never cease their flight, and beside which you smoked while I dreamed. Maurice Thompson, July, 1900. End of preface. Chapter 1 of Alice of Old Vincennes by Maurice Thompson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 1. Under the Cherry Tree. Up to the days of Indiana's early statehood, probably as late as 1825, there stood, in what is now the beautiful little city of Vincennes on the Wabash, the decaying remnant of an old and curiously gnarled cherry tree, known as the Roussillon tree, le cerisier de Monsieur Roussillon, as the French inhabitants called it, which, as long as it lived, bore fruit remarkable for richness of flavor and peculiar dark ruby depth of color. The exact spot where this noble old seedling from La Belle France flourished, declined, and died cannot be certainly pointed out, for in the rapid and happy growth of Vincennes many landmarks once notable, among them le cerisier de Monsieur Roussillon, have been destroyed, and the spots where they stood, once familiar to every eye in old Vincennes, are now lost in the pleasant confusion of the new town. The security of certain land titles may have largely depended upon the disappearance of old fixed objects here and there. Early records were loosely kept, indeed scarcely kept at all. Many were destroyed by designing land speculators, while those most carefully preserved often failed to give even a shadowy trace of the actual boundaries of the estates held thereby, so that the position of a house or tree not infrequently settled an important question of property rights left open by a primitive deed. At all events, the Roussillon cherry tree disappeared long ago, nobody living knows how, and with it also vanished quite as mysteriously all traces of the once important Roussillon estate. Not a record of the name even can be found, it is said, in church or county books. The old twisted gum-embossed cherry tree survived every other distinguishing feature of what was once the most picturesque and romantic place in Vincennes. Just north of it stood, in the early French days, a low rambling cabin surrounded by rude verandas overgrown with grapevines. This was the Roussillon place, the most pretentious home in all the Wabash country. Its owner was Gaspard Roussillon, a successful trader with the Indians. He was rich for the time and the place, influential to a degree, a man of some education who had brought with him to the wilderness a bundle of books and a taste for reading. From faded letters and dimly remembered talk of those who once clung fondly to the legends and traditions of old Vincennes, it is drawn that the Roussillon cherry tree stood not very far away from the present site of the Catholic Church, on a slight swell of ground overlooking a wide, marshy flat and silver current of the Wabash. If the tree grew there, then there too stood the Roussillon house with its cozy log rooms, its clay-daubed chimneys, and its grape-vined mantled verandas, while some distance away and nearer the river the rude fort with its huddled officers' quarters seemed to fling out over the wild landscape, through its squinting and lopsided portholes, a gaze of stubborn defiance. Not far off was the little log church where one good Father Beret, or as named by the Indians who all loved him, Father Blackrobe, performed the services of his sacred calling; and scattered all around were the cabins of traders, soldiers, and woodsmen, forming a queer little town, the like of which cannot now be seen anywhere on the earth. It is not known just when Vincennes was first founded, but most historians make the probable date very early in the 18th century, somewhere between 1710 and 1730. In 1810 the Roussillon cherry tree was thought by a distinguished botanical letter writer to be at least 50 years old, which would make the date of its planting about 1760. Certainly, as shown by the time-stained family records upon which this story of ours is based, it was a flourishing and wide-topped tree in early summer of 1778, its branches loaded to drooping with luscious fruit. So low did the dark red clusters hang at one point that a tall young girl standing on the ground easily reached the best ones, and made her lips purple with their juice while she ate them. That was long ago, measured by what has come to pass on the gentle swell of rich country from which Vincennes overlooks the Wabash. The new town flourishes notably, and its appearance marks the latest limit of progress. Electric cars in its streets, electric lights in its beautiful homes, the roar of railway trains coming and going in all directions, bicycles whirling hither and thither, the most fashionable styles of equipages, from brougham to pony phaeton, make the days of flint-lock guns and buckskin trousers seem ages down the past. And yet we are looking back over but a little more than 120 years to see Alice Roussillon standing under the cherry tree, and holding high a tempting cluster of fruit, while a very short, hump-backed youth looks up with longing eyes and vainly reaches for it. The tableau is not merely rustic, it is primitive. "Jump!" the girl is saying in French. "Jump, Jean! Jump high!" Yes, that was very long ago, in the days when women lightly braved what the strongest men would shrink from now. Alice Roussillon was tall, lithe, strongly knit, with an almost perfect figure, judging by what the sculptors carved for the form of Venus, and her face was comely and winning, if not absolutely beautiful. But the time and the place were vigorously indicated by her dress, which was of coarse stuff and simply designed. Plainly she was a child of the American wilderness, a daughter of old Vincennes on the Wabash in the time that tried men's souls. "Jump, Jean!" she cried, her face laughing with a show of cheek dimples, an arching of finely sketched brows, and the twinkling of large blue-gray eyes. "Jump high and get them!" While she waved her sun-browned hand holding the cherries aloft, the breeze blowing fresh from the southwest tossed her hair so that some loose strands shone like rimpled flames. The sturdy little hunchback did leap with surprising activity, but the treacherous brown hand went higher, so high that the combined altitude of his jump and the reach of his unnaturally long arms was overcome. Again and again he sprang vainly into the air comically like a long-legged squat-bodied frog. "And you brag of your agility and strength, Jean," she laughingly remarked, "but you can't take cherries when they are offered to you. What a clumsy bungler you are!" "I can climb and get some," he said with a hideously happy grin, and immediately embraced the bole of the tree, up which he began scrambling almost as fast as a squirrel. When he had mounted high enough to be extending a hand for a hold on a crotch, Alice grasped his leg near the foot and pulled him down, despite his clinging and struggling, until his hands clawed in the soft earth at the tree's root, while she held his captive leg almost vertically erect. It was a show of great strength, but Alice looked quite unconscious of it, laughing merrily, the dimples deepening in her plump cheeks, her forearm, now bared to the elbow, gleaming white and shapely while its muscles rippled on account of the jerking and kicking of Jean. All the time she was holding the cherries high in her other hand, shaking them by the twig to which their slender stems attached them, and saying in a sweet tantalizing tone, "What makes you climb downward after cherries, Jean? What a foolish fellow you are, indeed, trying to grabble cherries out of the ground as you do potatoes. I'm sure I didn't suppose that you knew so little as that." Her French was colloquial but quite good, showing here and there what we often notice in the speech of those who have been educated in isolated places far from that babel of polite energies which we call the world; something that may be described as a bookish cast appearing oddly in the midst of phrasing distinctly rustic and local, a peculiarity not easy to transfer from one language to another. Jean the hunchback was a muscular little deformity and a wonder of good nature. His head looked unnaturally large, nestling grotesquely between the points of his lifted and distorted shoulders, like a shaggy black animal in the fork of a broken tree. He was bellicose in his amiable way and never knew just when to acknowledge defeat. How long he might have kept up the hopeless struggle with the girl's invincible grip would be hard to guess. His release was caused by the approach of a third person, who wore the robe of a Catholic priest, and the countenance of a man who had lived and suffered a long time without much loss of physical strength and endurance. This was Père Beret, grizzly, short, compact, his face deeply lined, his mouth decidedly aslant on account of some lost teeth, and his eyes set deep under grey, shaggy brows. Looking at him when his features were in repose, a first impression might not have been favourable. But seeing him smile or hearing him speak changed everything. His voice was sweetness itself, and his smile won you on the instant. Something like a pervading sorrow always seemed to be close behind his eyes and under his speech, yet he was a genial, sometimes almost jolly man, very prone to join in the lighter amusements of his people. "Children, children, my children!" he called out as he approached along a little pathway leading up from the direction of the church. "What are you doing now? Bah, there, Alice, will you pull Jean's leg off?" At first they did not hear him, they were so nearly deafened by their own vocal discords. "Why are you standing on your head with your feet so high in air, Jean?" he added. "It's not a polite attitude in the presence of a young lady. Are you a pig, that you poke your nose in the dirt?" Alice now turned her bright head and gave Père Beret a look of frank welcome, which at the same time shot a beam of wilful self-assertion. "My daughter, are you trying to help Jean up the tree, feet foremost?" the priest added, standing where he had halted just outside of the straggling yard fence. He had his hands on his hips and was quietly chuckling at the scene before him, as one who, although old, sympathized with the natural and harmless sportiveness of young people, and would as lief as not join in a prank or two. "You see what I'm doing, Father Beret," said Alice. "I am preventing a great damage to you. You will maybe lose a good many cherry pies and dumplings if I let Jean go. He was climbing the tree to pilfer the fruit. So I pulled him down, you understand." "Ta, ta!" exclaimed the good man, shaking his grey head. "We must reason with the child. Let go his leg, daughter. I will vouch for him. Eh, Jean?" Alice released the hunchback, then laughed gaily and tossed the cluster of cherries into his hand, whereupon he began munching them voraciously and talking at the same time. "I knew I could get them," he boasted. "And see, I have them now." He hopped around looking like a species of ill-formed monkey. Père Beret came and leaned on the low fence close to Alice. She was almost as tall as he. "The sun scorches to-day," he said, beginning to mop his furrowed face with a red-flowered cotton handkerchief. "And from the look of the sky yonder," pointing southward, "it is going to bring on a storm. How is Madame Roussillon to-day?" "She is complaining, as she usually does when she feels extremely well," said Alice. "That's why I had to take her place at the oven and bake pies. I got hot and came out to catch a bit of this breeze. Oh, but you needn't smile and look greedy, Père Beret. The pies are not for your teeth." "My daughter, I am not a glutton, I hope. I had meat not 2 hours since, some broiled young squirrels with cress, sent me by René de Ronville. He never forgets his old father." "Oh, I never forget you either, mon père. I thought of you to-day every time I spread a crust and filled it with cherries. And when I took out a pie all brown and hot, the red juice bubbling out of it so good smelling and tempting, do you know what I said to myself?"
"How could I know, my child?"
"Well, I thought this: not a single bite of that pie does Father Beret get."
"Why so, daughter?"
"Because you said it was bad of me to read novels, and told Mother Roussillon to hide them from me. I've had any amount of trouble about it."
"Ta ta! Read the good books that I gave you. They will soon kill the taste for these silly romances."
"I tried," said Alice. "I tried very hard, and it's no use. Your books are dull and stupidly heavy. What do I care about something that a queer lot of saints did hundreds of years ago, in times of plague and famine? Saints must have been poky people, and it is poky people who care to read about them, I think. I like reading about brave, heroic men and beautiful women, and war and love."
Père Beret looked away with a curious expression in his face, his eyes half closed.
"And I'll tell you now, Father Beret," Alice went on after a pause, "no more claret and pies do you get until I can have my own sort of books back again to read as I please."
She stamped her moccasin-shod foot with decided energy. The good priest broke into a hearty laugh, and taking off his cap of grass straw, mechanically scratched his bald head. He looked at the tall, strong girl before him for a moment or two, and it would have been hard for the best physiognomist to decide just how much of approval and how much of disapproval that look really signified. Although, as Father Beret had said, the sun's heat was violent, causing that gentle soul to pass his bundled handkerchief with a wiping circular motion over his bald and bedewed pate, the wind was momently refreshing, while up from behind the trees on the horizon beyond the river a cloud was rising blue-black, tumbled and grim against the sky. "Well," said the priest, evidently trying hard to exchange his laugh for a look of regretful resignation, "you will have your own way, my child, and—"
"Then you will have pies galore, and no end of claret," she interrupted, at the same time stepping to the withe-tied and peg-latched gate of the yard and opening it. "Come in, you dear good father, before the rain shall begin, and sit with me on the galerie," the Creole word for veranda, "till the storm is over." Father Beret seemed not loath to enter, albeit he offered a weak protest against delaying some task he had in hand. Alice reached forth and pulled him in, then reclosed the queer little gate and pegged it. She caressingly passed her arm through his and looked into his weather-stained old face with childlike affection. There was not a photographer's camera to be had in those days, but what if a tourist with one in hand could have been there to take a snapshot at the priest and the maiden, as they walked arm in arm to that squat little veranda? The picture to-day would be worth its weight in a first-water diamond. It would include the cabin, the cherry tree, a glimpse of the raw wild background, and a sharp portrait group of Père Beret, Alice, and Jean the hunchback. To compare it with a photograph of the same spot now would give a perfect impression of the historic atmosphere, colour, and conditions which cannot be set in words. But we must not belittle the power of verbal description. What if a thoroughly trained newspaper reporter had been given the freedom of old Vincennes on the Wabash during the first week of June, 1778, and we now had his printed story. What a supplement to the photographer's pictures! Well, we have neither photographs nor graphic report, yet there they are before us, the gowned and straw-capped priest, the fresh-faced, coarsely clad and vigorous girl, the grotesque little hunchback, all just as real as life itself. Each of us can see them, even with closed eyes. Led by that wonderful guide imagination, we step back a century and more to look over a scene at once strangely attractive and unspeakably forlorn. What was it that drew people away from the old countries, from the cities, the villages and the vineyards of beautiful France, for example, to dwell in the wilderness amid wild beasts and wilder savage Indians, with a rude cabin for a home and the exposures and hardships of pioneer life for their daily experience? Men like Gaspard Roussillon are of a distinct stamp. Take him as he was. Born in France, on the banks of the Rhone near Avignon, he came as a youth to Canada, whence he drifted on the tide of adventure this way and that, until at last he found himself, with a wife, at Post Vincennes, that lonely picket of religion and trade which was to become the centre of civilizing energy for the great northwestern territory. Monsieur Roussillon had no children of his own, so his kind heart opened freely to two fatherless and motherless waifs. These were Alice, now called Alice Roussillon, and the hunchback Jean. The former was 12 years old when he adopted her, a child of Protestant parents, while Jean had been taken when a mere babe, after his parents had been killed and scalped by Indians. Madame Roussillon, a professed invalid, whose appetite never failed and whose motherly kindness expressed itself most often through strains of monotonous falsetto scolding, was a woman of little education and no refinement, while her husband clung tenaciously to his love of books, especially to the romances most in vogue when he took leave of France. Monsieur Roussillon had been, in a way, Alice's teacher, though not greatly inclined to abet Father Beret in his kindly efforts to make a Catholic of the girl, and most treacherously disposed toward the good priest in the matter of his well-meant attempts to prevent her from reading and re-reading the aforesaid romances. But for many weeks past Gaspard Roussillon had been absent from home, looking after his trading schemes with the Indians; and Père Beret, acting on the suggestion of the proverb about the absent cat and the playing mouse, had formed an alliance offensive and defensive with Madame Roussillon, in which it was strictly stipulated that all novels and romances were to be forcibly taken and securely hidden away from Mademoiselle Alice; which, to the best of Madame Roussillon's ability, had accordingly been done. Now, while the wind strengthened and the softly booming summer shower came on apace, the heavy cloud lifting as it advanced and showing under it the dark grey sheet of the rain, Père Beret and Alice sat under the clapboard roof behind the vines of the veranda and discussed, what was generally uppermost in the priest's mind upon such occasions, the good of Alice's immortal soul; a subject not absorbingly interesting to her at any time. It was a standing grief to the good old priest, this strange perversity of the girl in the matter of religious duty as he saw it. True, she had a faithful guardian in Gaspard Roussillon; but much as he had done to aid the Church's work in general, for he was always vigorous and liberal, he could not be looked upon as a very good Catholic, and of course his influence was not effective in the right direction. But then Père Beret saw no reason why, in due time, and with patient work, aided by Madame Roussillon, and notwithstanding Gaspard's treachery, he might not safely lead Alice, whom he loved as a dear child, into the arms of the Holy Church, to serve which faithfully, at all hazards and in all places, was his highest aim. "Ah, my child," he was saying, "you are a sweet, good girl after all, much better than you make yourself out to be. Your duty will control you. You will do it nobly at last, my child." "True enough, Father Beret, true enough," she responded, laughing. "Your perception is most excellent, which I will prove to you immediately." She rose while speaking, and went into the house. "I'll return in a minute or two," she called back from a region which Père Beret well knew was that of the pantry. "Don't get impatient and go away." Père Beret laughed softly at the preposterous suggestion that he would even dream of going out in the rain, which was now roaring heavily on the loose board roof, and miss a cut of cherry pie, a cherry pie of Alice's making. And the Roussillon claret, too, was always excellent. "Ah, child," he thought, "your old father is not going away."
She presently returned bearing on a wooden tray a ruby-stained pie and a short stout bottle flanked by 2 glasses. "Of course I'm better than I sometimes appear to be," she said almost humbly, but with mischief still in her voice and eyes, "and I shall get to be very good when I have grown old. The sweetness of my present nature is in this pie." She set the tray on a 3-legged stool which she pushed close to him. "There now," she said, "let the rain come. You'll be happy, rain or shine, while the pie and wine last, I'll be bound." Père Beret fell to eating right heartily, meantime handing Jean a liberal piece of the luscious pie. "It is good, my daughter, very good indeed," the priest remarked with his mouth full. "Madame Roussillon has not neglected your culinary education." Alice filled a glass for him. It was Bordeaux, and very fragrant. The bouquet reminded him of his sunny boyhood in France, of his journey up to Paris, and of his careless, joy-brimmed youth in the gay city. How far away, how misty, yet how thrillingly sweet it all was! He sat with half-closed eyes awhile, sipping and dreaming. The rain lasted nearly 2 hours, but the sun was out again when Père Beret took leave of his young friend. They had been having another good-natured quarrel over the novels, and Madame Roussillon had come out on the veranda to join in. "I've hidden every book of them," said Madame, a stout and swarthy woman whose pearl-white teeth were her only mark of beauty. Her voice indicated great stubbornness. "Good, good! You have done your very duty, madame," said Père Beret, with immense approval in his charming voice. "But, father, you said a while ago that I should have my own way about this," Alice spoke up with spirit. "And on the strength of that remark of yours I gave you the pie and wine. You've eaten my pie and swigged the wine, and now—" Père Beret put on his straw cap, adjusting it carefully over the shining dome out of which had come so many thoughts of wisdom, kindness, and human sympathy. This done, he gently laid a hand on Alice's bright crown of hair, and said, "Bless you, my child. I will pray to the Prince of Peace for you as long as I live, and I will never cease to beg the Holy Virgin to intercede for you and lead you to the Holy Church." He turned and went away, but when he was no farther than the gate, Alice called out, "Oh, Father Beret, I forgot to show you something." She ran forth to him, and added in a low tone, "You know that Madame Roussillon has hidden all the novels from me." She was fumbling to get something out of the loose front of her dress. "Well, just take a glance at this, will you?" And she showed him a little leather-bound volume much cracked along the hinges of the back. It was Manon Lescaut, that dreadful romance by the famous Abbé Prévost. Père Beret frowned and went his way shaking his head, but before he reached his little hut near the church he was laughing in spite of himself. "She's not so bad, not so bad," he thought aloud. "It's only her young independent spirit taking the bit for a wild run. In her sweet soul she is as good as she is pure." End of chapter 1. Chapter 2 of Alice of Old Vincennes by Maurice Thompson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 2. A Letter from Afar. Although Father Beret was for many years a missionary on the Wabash, most of the time at Vincennes, the fact that no mention of him can be found in the records is not stranger than many other things connected with the old town's history. He was, like nearly all the men of his calling in that day, a self-effacing and modest hero, apparently quite unaware that he deserved attention. He and Father Gibault, whose name is so beautifully and nobly connected with the stirring achievements of Colonel George Rogers Clarke, were close friends and often companions. Probably Father Gibault himself, whose fame will never fade, would have been today as obscure as Father Beret, but for the opportunity given him by Clarke to fix his name in the list of heroic patriots who assisted in winning the great Northwest from the English. Vincennes, even in the earliest days of its history, somehow kept up communication, and, considering the circumstances, close relations with New Orleans. It was much nearer Detroit, but the Louisiana colony stood next to France in the imagination and longing of priests, voyageurs, coureurs de bois, and reckless adventurers who had Latin blood in their veins.
Father Beret first came to Vincennes from New Orleans, the voyage up the Mississippi, Ohio, and Wabash, in a pirogue lasting through a whole summer and far into the autumn. Since his arrival the post had experienced many vicissitudes, and at the time in which our story opens, the British government claimed right of dominion over the great territory drained by the Wabash, and indeed over a large indefinitely outlined part of the North American continent lying above Mexico, a claim just then being vigorously questioned, flintlock in hand, by the Anglo-American colonies. Of course, the handful of French people at Vincennes, so far away from every center of information, and wholly occupied with their trading, trapping, and missionary work, were late finding out that war existed between England and her colonies. Nor did it really matter much with them one way or another. They felt secure in their lonely situation, and so went on selling their trinkets, weapons, domestic implements, blankets, and intoxicating liquors to the Indians, whom they held bound to them with a power never possessed by any other white dwellers in the wilderness. Father Beret was probably subordinate to Father Gibault. At all events, the latter appears to have had nominal charge of Vincennes, and it can scarcely be doubted that he left Father Beret on the Wabash while he went to live and labor for a time at Kaskaskia, beyond the plains of Illinois. It is a curious fact that religion and the power of rum and brandy worked together successfully for a long time in giving the French posts almost absolute influence over the wild and savage men by whom they were always surrounded. The good priests deprecated the traffic in liquors and tried hard to control it, but soldiers of fortune and reckless traders were in the majority, their interests taking precedence of all spiritual demands and carrying everything along. What could the brave missionaries do but make the very best of a perilous situation? In those days wine was drunk by almost everybody, its use at table and as an article of incidental refreshment and social pleasure being practically universal. Wherefore the steps of reform in the matter of intemperance were but rudimentary, and in all places beset by well nigh insurmountable difficulties. In fact, the exigencies of frontier life demanded, perhaps, the very stimulus which, when overindulged in, caused so much evil. Malaria loaded the air, and the most efficacious drugs now at command were then undiscovered or could not be had. Intoxicants were the only popular specific. Men drank to prevent contracting ague, drank again between rigors to cure it, and yet again to brace themselves during convalescence. But if the effect of rum as a beverage had strong allurement for the white man, it made an absolute slave of the Indian, who never hesitated for a moment to undertake any task, no matter how hard, bear any privation, even the most terrible, or brave any danger, although it might demand reckless desperation, if in the end a well-filled bottle or jug appeared as his reward. Of course the traders did not overlook such a source of power. Alcoholic liquor became their implement of almost magical work in controlling the lives, labors, and resources of the Indians. The priests, with their captivating story of the cross, had a large influence in softening savage natures and averting many an awful danger; but when everything else failed, rum always came to the rescue of a threatened French post. We need not wonder, then, when we are told that Father Beret made no sign of distress or disapproval upon being informed of the arrival of a boat loaded with rum, brandy, or gin. It was René de Ronville who brought the news, the same René already mentioned as having given the priest a plate of squirrels. He was sitting on the door-sill of Father Beret's hut when the old man reached it after his visit at the Roussillon home, and held in his hand a letter which he appeared proud to deliver. "A bateau and 7 men with a cargo of liquor came during the rain," he said, rising and taking off his curious cap, which, made of an animal's skin, had a tail jauntily dangling from its crown tip. "And here is a letter for you, father. The bateau is from New Orleans. 8 men started with it, but 1 went ashore to hunt and was killed by an Indian." Father Beret took the letter without apparent interest, and said, "Thank you, my son. Sit down again. The door log is not wetter than the stools inside. I will sit by you." The wind had driven a flood of rain into the cabin through the open door, and water twinkled in puddles here and there on the floor's puncheons. They sat down side by side, Father Beret fingering the letter in an absent-minded way. "There'll be a jolly time of it to-night," René de Ronville remarked. "A roaring time." "Why do you say that, my son?" the priest demanded. "The wine and the liquor," was the reply. "Much drinking will be done.
The men have all been dry here for some time, you know, and are as thirsty as sand. They are making ready to enjoy themselves down at the river house." "Ah, the poor souls!" sighed Father Beret, speaking as one whose thoughts were wandering far away. "Why don't you read your letter, father?" René added. The priest started, turned the soiled square of paper over in his hand, and thrust it inside his robe. "It can wait," he said. Then changing his voice, "The squirrels you gave me were excellent, my son. It was good of you to think of me," he added, laying his hand on René's arm. "Oh, I'm glad if I have pleased you, Father Beret, for you are so kind to me always, and to everybody. When I killed the squirrels I said to myself, 'These are young, juicy, and tender. Father Beret must have these,' so I brought them along." The young man rose to go, for he was somehow impressed that Father Beret must wish opportunity to read his letter, and would prefer to be left alone with it. But the priest pulled him down again. "Stay a while," he said. "I have not had a talk with you for some time." René looked a trifle uneasy. "You will not drink any to night, my son," Father Beret added. "You must not. Do you hear?" The young man's eyes and mouth at once began to have a sullen expression. Evidently he was not pleased and felt rebellious, but it was hard for him to resist Father Beret, whom he loved, as did every soul in the post. The priest's voice was sweet and gentle, yet positive to a degree. René did not say a word. "Promise me that you will not taste liquor this night," Father Beret went on, grasping the young man's arm more firmly. "Promise me, my son, promise me." Still René was silent. The men did not look at each other, but gazed away across the country beyond the Wabash to where a glory from the western sun flamed on the upper rim of a great cloud fragment creeping along the horizon. Warm as the day had been, a delicious coolness now began to temper the air, for the wind had shifted into the northwest. A meadowlark sang dreamily in the wild grass of the low lands hard by, over which 2 or 3 prairie hawks hovered with wings that beat rapidly. "Eh bien, I must go," said René presently, getting to his feet nimbly, and evading Father Beret's hand, which would have held him. "Not to the river house, my son?" said the priest appealingly. "No, not there. I have another letter. One for Monsieur Roussillon. It came by the boat, too. I go to give it to Madame Roussillon." René de Ranville was a dark, weather-stained young fellow, neither tall nor short, wearing buckskin moccasins, trousers, and tunic. His eyes were dark brown, keen, quick-moving, set well under heavy brows. A razor had probably never touched his face, and his thin, curly beard crinkled over his strongly turned cheeks and chin, while his moustaches sprang out quite fiercely above his full-lipped, almost sensual mouth. He looked wiry and active, a man not to be lightly reckoned with in a trial of bodily strength and will power. Father Beret's face and voice changed on the instant. He laughed dryly, and said, with a sly gleam in his eyes, "You could spend the evening pleasantly with Madame Roussillon and Jean. Jean, you know, is a very amusing fellow." René brought forth the letter of which he had spoken, and held it up before Father Beret's face. "Maybe you think I haven't any letter for Monsieur Roussillon," he blurted, "and maybe you are quite certain that I am not going to the house to take the letter." "Monsieur Roussillon is absent, you know," Father Beret suggested. "But cherry pies are just as good while he's gone as when he's at home, and I happen to know that there are some particularly delicious ones in the pantry of Madame Roussillon. Mademoiselle Alice gave me a juicy sample. But then, I dare say, you do not care to have your pie served by her hand. It would interfere with your appetite, eh, my son?" René turned short about wagging his head and laughing, and so, with his back to the priest, he strode away along the wet path leading to the Roussillon place. Father Beret gazed after him, his face relaxing to a serious expression in which a trace of sadness and gloom spread like an elusive twilight. He took out his letter, but did not glance at it, simply holding it tightly gripped in his sinewy right hand. Then his old eyes stared vacantly, as eyes do when their sight is cast back many, many years into the past. The missive was from beyond the sea. He knew the handwriting. A waft of the flowers of Avignon seemed to rise out of it, as if by the pressure of his grasp. A stoop-shouldered, burly man went by, leading a pair of goats, a kid following. He was making haste excitedly, keeping the goats at a lively trot. "Bonjour, Père Beret," he flung out breezily, and walked rapidly on. "Ah, his mind is busy with the newly arrived cargo," thought the old priest, returning the salutation. "His throat aches for the liquor. The poor man." Then he read again the letter's superscription, and made a faltering move, as if to break the seal. His hands trembled violently, his face looked grey and drawn. "Come on, you brutes!" cried the receding man, jerking the thongs of skin by which he led the goats. Father Beret rose and turned into his damp little hut, where the light was dim on the crucifix hanging opposite the door, against the clay-daubed wall. It was a bare, unsightly, clammy room. A rude bed on one side, a shelf for table, and 2 or 3 wooden stools constituting the furniture, while the uneven puncheons of the floor wobbled and clattered under the priest's feet. An unopened letter is always a mysterious thing. We who receive 3 or 4 mails every day scan each little paper square with a speculative eye. Most of us know what sweet uncertainty hangs on the opening of envelopes whose contents may be almost anything except something important, and what a vague yet delicious thrill comes with the snip of the paper knife. But if we be in a foreign land and long years absent from home, then is a letter subtly powerful to move us, even more before it is opened than after it is read. It has been many years since a letter from home had come to Father Beret. The last, before the one now in hand, had made him ill of nostalgia, fairly shaking his iron determination never to quit for a moment his life work as a missionary. Ever since that day he had found it harder to meet the many and stern demands of a most difficult and exacting duty. Now the mere touch of the paper in his hand gave him a sense of returning weakness, dissatisfaction, and longing. The home of his boyhood, the rushing of the Rhone, a seat in a shady nook of the garden, Madeline, his sister, prattling beside him, and his mother singing somewhere about the house, it all came back and went over him and through him, making his heart sink strangely, while another voice, the sweetest ever heard, but she was ineffable, and her memory a forbidden fragrance. Father Beret tottered across the forlorn little room and knelt before the crucifix, holding his clasped hands high, the letter pressed between them. His lips moved in prayer, but made no sound. His whole frame shook violently. It would be unpardonable desecration to enter the chamber of Father Beret's soul and look upon his sacred and secret trouble, nor must we even speculate as to its particulars. The good old man writhed and wrestled before the cross for a long time, until at last he seemed to receive the calmness and strength he prayed for so fervently. Then he rose, tore the letter into pieces so small that not a word remained whole, and squeezed them so firmly together that they were compressed into a tiny, solid ball, which he let fall through a crack between the floor puncheons. After waiting 20 years for that letter, hungry as his heart was, he did not even open it when at last it arrived. He would never know what message it bore. The link between him and the old sweet days was broken forever. Now, with God's help, he could do his work to the end. He went and stood in his doorway, leaning against the side. Was it a mere coincidence that the meadowlark flew up just then from its grass tuft, and came to the roof's comb overhead, where it lit with a light yet audible stroke of its feet, and began fluting its tender, lonesome-sounding strain? If Father Beret heard it, he gave no sign of recognition. Very likely he was thinking about the cargo of liquor and how he could best counteract its baleful influence. He looked toward the "River House," as the inhabitants had named a large shanty which stood on the bluff of the Wabash, not far from where the road bridge at present crosses, and saw men gathering there. Meantime, René de Ronville had delivered Madame Roussillon's letter with due promptness. Of course, such a service demanded pie and claret. What still better pleased him, Alice chose to be more amiable than was usually her custom when he called. They sat together in the main room of the house, where Monsieur Roussillon kept his books, his curiosities of Indian manufacture collected here and there, and his surplus firearms, swords, pistols, and knives, ranged not unpleasingly around the walls. Of course, along with the letter, René bore the news, so interesting to himself, of the boat's tempting cargo just discharged at the river house. Alice understood her friend's danger, felt it in the intense enthusiasm of his voice and manner. She had once seen the men carousing on a similar occasion when she was but a child, and the impression then made still remained in her memory. Instinctively she resolved to hold René by one means or another away from the river house if possible. So she managed to keep him occupied eating pie, sipping watered claret and chatting until night came on and Madame Roussillon brought in a lamp. Then he hurriedly snatched his cap from the floor beside him and got up to go. "Come and look at my handiwork," Alice quickly said. "My shelf of pies, I mean." She led him to the pantry where a dozen or more of the cherry pâtés were ranged in order. "I made every one of them this morning and baked them. Had them all out of the oven before the rain came up. Don't you think me a wonder of cleverness and industry? Father Perret was polite enough to flatter me. But you just eat what you want and say nothing. You are not polite, Monsieur René de Ronville." "I've been showing you what I thought of your goodies," said René. "Eating's better than talking, you know. So I'll just take one more," and he helped himself. "Isn't that compliment enough?" "A few such would make me another hot day's work," she replied, laughing. "Pretty talk would be cheaper and more satisfactory in the long run. Even the flour in these pâtés I ground with my own hand in an Indian mortar. That was hard work, too." By this time René had forgotten the river house and the liquor. With softening eyes he gazed at Alice's rounded cheeks and sheeny hair over which the light from the curious earthen lamp she bore in her hand flickered most effectively. He loved her madly, but his fear of her was more powerful than his love. She gave him no opportunity to speak what he felt, having ever ready a quick, bright change of mood and manner when she saw him plucking up courage to address her in a sentimental way. Their relations had long been somewhat familiar, which was but natural, considering their youth and the circumstances of their daily life; but Alice somehow had kept a certain distance open between them, so that very warm friendship could not suddenly resolve itself into a troublesome passion on René's part. We need not attempt to analyze a young girl's feelings and motives in such a case. What she does and what she thinks are mysteries even to her own understanding. The influence most potent in shaping the rudimentary character of Alice Tarleton, called Roussillon, had been only such as a lonely frontier post could generate. Her associations with men and women had, with few exceptions, been unprofitable in an educational way, while her reading in Monsieur Roussillon's little library could not have given her any practical knowledge of manners and life. She was fond of René de Ronville, and it would have been quite in accordance with the law of ordinary human forces, indeed almost the inevitable thing, for her to love and marry him in the fullness of time. But her imagination was outgrowing her surroundings. Books had given her a world of romance wherein she moved at will, meeting a class of people far different from those who actually shared her experiences. Her day dreams and her night dreams partook much more of what she had read and imagined than that of what she had seen and heard in the raw little world around her. Her affection for René was interfered with by her large admiration for the heroic, masterful, and magnetic knights who charged through the romances of the Roussillon collection. For although René was unquestionably brave, and more than passably handsome, he had no armour, no war horse, no shining lance and embossed shield. The difference indeed was great. Those who love to contend against the fatal drift of our age toward over-education could find in Alice Tarleton, foster daughter of Gaspard Roussillon, a primitive example, an elementary case in point. What could her book education do but set up stumbling blocks in the path of happiness? She was learning to prefer the ideal to the real. Her soul was developing itself as best it could for the enjoyment of conditions and things absolutely foreign to the possibilities of her lot in life. Perhaps it was the light and heat of imagination shining out through Alice's face which gave her beauty such a fascinating power. René saw it and felt its electrical strokes send a sweet shiver through his heart while he stood before her. "You are very beautiful to night, Alice," he presently said, with a suddenness which took even her alertness by surprise. A flush rose to his dark face and immediately gave way to a greyish pallor. His heart came near stopping on the instant, he was so shocked by his own daring, but he laid a hand on her hair, stroking it softly. Just a moment she was at a loss, looking a trifle embarrassed, then with a merry laugh she stepped aside and said, "That sounds better, Monsieur René de Ronville, much better. You will be as polite as Father Beret after a little more training." She slipped past him while speaking and made her way back again to the main room, whence she called to him, "Come here, I've something to show you." He obeyed, a sheepish trace on his countenance betraying his self-consciousness. When he came near Alice she was taking from its buckhorn hook on the wall a rapier, one of a beautiful pair hanging side by side. "Papa Roussillon gave me these," she said with great animation. "He bought them of an Indian who had kept them a long time. Where he came across them he would not tell. But look how beautiful! Did you ever see anything so fine?" Guard and hilt were of silver. The blade, although somewhat corroded, still showed the fine wavy lines of Damascus steel and traces of delicate engraving, while in the end of the hilt was set a large oval turquoise. "A very queer present to give a girl," said René. "What can you do with them?" A captivating flash of playfulness came into her face, and she sprang backward, giving the sword a semicircular turn with her wrist. The blade sent forth a keen hiss as it cut the air close, very close, to René's nose. He jerked his head and flung up his hand. She laughed merrily, standing beautifully poised before him, the rapier's point slightly elevated. Her short skirt left her feet and ankles free to show their graceful proportions, and the perfect pose in which they held her supple body. "You see what I can do with the colichemard, eh, Monsieur René de Ronville?" she exclaimed, giving him a smile which fairly blinded him. "Notice how very near to your neck I can thrust and yet not touch it. Now." She darted the keen point under his chin and drew it away so quickly that the stroke was like a glint of sunlight. "What do you think of that as a nice and accurate piece of skill?" She again resumed her pose, the right foot advanced, the left arm well back, her lissome, finely developed body leaning slightly forward. René's hands were up before his face in a defensive position, palms outward. Just then a chorus of men's voices sounded in the distance. The river house was beginning its carousal with a song. Alice let fall her sword's point and listened. René looked about for his cap. "I must be going," he said. Another and a louder swish of the rapier made him pirouette and dodge again with great energy. "Don't!" he cried. "That's dangerous. You'll put out my eyes. I never saw such a girl." She laughed at him and kept on whipping the air dangerously near his eyes until she had driven him backward as far as he could squeeze himself into a corner of the room. Madame Roussillon came to the door from the kitchen and stood looking in and laughing with her hands on her hips. By this time the rapier was making a criss-cross pattern of flashing lines close to the young man's head, while Alice, in the enjoyment of her exercise, seemed to concentrate all the glowing rays of her beauty in her face, her eyes dancing merrily. "Quit now, Alice," he begged, half in fun and half in abject fear. "Please quit. I surrender." She thrust to the wall on either side of him, then, springing lightly backward a pace, stood at guard. Her thick yellow hair had fallen over her neck and shoulders in a loose wavy mass, out of which her face beamed with a bewitching effect upon her captive. René, glad enough to have a cessation of his peril, stood laughing dryly, but the singing down at the river house was swelling louder, and he made another movement to go. "You surrendered, you remember," cried Alice, renewing the sword play. "Sit down on the chair there, and make yourself comfortable. You are not going down yonder to night. You are going to stay here and talk with me and Mother Roussillon. We are lonesome, and you are good company." A shot rang out keen and clear. There was a sudden tumult that broke up the distant singing, and presently more firing at varying intervals cut the night air from the direction of the river. Jean the hunchback came in to say that there was a row of some sort. He had seen men running across the common as if in pursuit of a fugitive, but the moonlight was so dim that he could not be sure what it all meant. René picked up his cap and bolted out of the house. End of chapter 2. Chapter 3 of Alice of Old Vincennes by Maurice Thompson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain.
3. The Rape of the Demijohn. The row down at the river house was more noise than fight, so far as results seemed to indicate. It was all about a small Dame Jeanne of fine brandy, which an Indian by the name of Longhair had seized and run off with at the height of the carousal. He must have been soberer than his pursuers, or naturally fleeter, for not one of them could catch him or even keep long in sight of him. Some pistols were emptied while the race was on, and 2 or 3 of the men swore roundly to having seen Longhair jump sidewise and stagger, as if one of the shots had taken effect. But although the moon was shining, he someway disappeared, they could not understand just how, far down beside the river below the fort and the church. It was not a very uncommon thing for an Indian to steal what he wanted, and in most cases light punishment followed conviction. But it was felt to be a capital offense for an Indian or anybody else to rape a demijohn of fine brandy, especially one sent as a present by a friend in New Orleans to Lieutenant Governor Abbott, who had until recently been the commandant of the post. Every man at the river house recognized and resented the enormity of Longhair's crime, and each was, for the moment, ready to be his judge and his executioner. He had broken at once every rule of frontier etiquette and every bond of sympathy. Nor was Longhair ignorant of the danger involved in his daring enterprise. He had beforehand carefully and stolidly weighed all the conditions, and, true to his Indian nature, had concluded that a little wicker-covered bottle of brandy was well worth the risk of his life. So he had put himself in condition for a great race by slipping out and getting rid of his weapons and all surplus weight of clothes. This incident brought the drinking bout at the river house to a sudden end. But nothing further came of it that night, and no record of it would be found in these pages, but for the fact that Longhair afterwards became an important character in the stirring historical drama which had old Vincennes for its centre of energy. René de Ronville probably felt himself in bad luck when he arrived at the river house just too late to share in the liquor or to join in chasing the bold thief. He listened with interest, however, to the story of Longhair's capture of the commandant's demijohn, and could not refrain from saying that if he had been present there would have been a quite different result. "I would have shot him before he got to that door," he said, drawing his heavy flint-lock pistol and going through the motions of one aiming quickly and firing. Indeed, so vigorously in earnest was he with the pantomime that he actually did fire, unintentionally of course, the ball burying itself in the door-jamb. He was laughed at by those present for being more excited than they who witnessed the whole thing. One of them, a leathery-faced and grizzled old sinner, leered at him contemptuously and said in queer French, with a curious accent caught from long use of backwoods English, "Listen how the boy brags. Ye might think, to hear René talk, that he actually amounted to a big pile." This personage was known to every soul in Vincennes as Oncle Jason, and when Oncle Jason spoke, the whole town felt bound to listen. "And how well he shoots, too," he added with an intolerable wink. "Aimed at the door and hit the post. Certainly Longhair would have been in great danger. Oh, yes, he'd have killed Longhair at the first shot, wouldn't he, though?" Oncle Jason had the air of a large man, but the stature of a small one. In fact, he was shriveled bodily to a degree which suggested comparison with a sun-dried wisp of hickory bark; and when he chuckled, as he was now doing, his mouth puckered itself until it looked like a scar on his face. From cap to moccasins he had every mark significant of a desperate character, and yet there was about him something that instantly commanded the confidence of rough men, the look of self-sufficiency and superior capability always to be found in connection with immense will-power. His 60 years of exposure, hardship, and danger seemed to have but toughened his physique and strengthened his vitality. Out of his small hazel eyes gleamed a light as keen as ice. "All right, Oncle Jason," said René, laughing and blowing the smoke out of his pistol. "'Twas you all the same who let Longhair trot off with the governor's brandy, not I. If you could have hit even a door-post it might have been better." Oncle Jason took off his cap and looked down into it in a way he had when about to say something final. "Ventre bleu! I did not shoot at Longhair at all," he said, speaking slowly, "because the scoundrel was unarmed. He didn't have on even a knife, and he was having enough to do dodging the bullets that the rest of 'em were plumping at him without any compliments from me to bother him more." "Well?"
René replied, turning away with a laugh. "If I'd been scalped by the Indians, as you have, I don't think there would be any particular reason why I should wait for an Indian thief to go and arm himself before I accepted him as a target." Oncle Jason lifted a hand involuntarily and rubbed his scalpless crown. Then he chuckled with a grotesque grimace, as if the recollection of having his head skinned were the funniest thing imaginable. "When you've killed as many of 'em as Oncle Jason has," remarked a bystander to René, "you'll not be so hungry for blood, maybe." "Especially after ye've took 59 scalps to pay for your one," added Oncle Jason, replacing his cap over the hairless area of his crown. The men who had been chasing Long Hair presently came straggling back with their stories. Each had a distinct one of how the fugitive escaped. They were wild-looking fellows, most of them somewhat intoxicated, all profusely liberal with their stock of picturesque profanity. They represented the roughest element of the well-nigh lawless post. "I'm positive that he's wounded," said one. "Jacques and I shot at him together, so that our pistols sounded just as if only one had been fired. Bang! That way! And he leaped sideways, for all the world like a bird with a broken leg. I thought he'd fall, but vey, he ran faster 'n ever, and all at once he was gone. Just disappeared." "Well, to morrow we'll get him," said another. "You and I and Jacques, we'll take up his trail, the thief, and follow him till we find him. He can't get off so easy." "I don't know so well about that," said another. "It's Long Hair, you must remember, and Long Hair is no common buck that just anybody can find asleep. You know what Long Hair is. Nobody's ever got even with him yet. That's so, ain't it? Just ask Oncle Jason if you don't believe it." The next morning Long Hair was tracked to the river's edge. He had been wounded, but whether seriously or not could only be conjectured. A sprinkle of blood here and there, quite a dash of it, reddened the grass and clumps of weeds he had run through, and ended close to the water, into which it looked as if he had plunged with a view to baffling pursuit. Indeed, pursuit was baffled. No further trace could be found by which to follow the cunning fugitive. Some of the men consoled themselves by saying, without believing, that Long Hair was probably lying drowned at the bottom of the river. "Pas du tout," observed Oncle Jason, his short pipe askew far over in the corner of his mouth. "Not a bit of it is that Indian drowned. He's just as live as a fat cat this minute, and as drunk as the devil. He'll get some of your scalps yet after he's guzzled all that brandy and slept a week." It finally transpired that Oncle Jason was partly right and partly wrong. Long Hair was alive, even as a fat cat, perhaps, but not drunk, for in trying to swim with the rotund little Dame Jeanne under his arm, he lost hold of it and it went to the bottom of the Wabash, where it may be lying at this moment, patiently waiting for some one to fish it out of its bed deep in the sand and mud, and break the ancient wax from its neck. René de Ronville, after the chase of Long Hair had been given over, went to tell Father Beret what had happened, and, finding the priest's hut empty, turned into the path leading to the Roussillon place, which was at the head of a narrow street laid out in a direction at right angles to the river's course. He passed 2 or 3 diminutive cabins, all as much alike as beehives. Each had its squat veranda and thatched or clapboarded roof held in place by weight poles ranged in roughly parallel rows, and each had the face of the wall under its veranda neatly daubed with a greyish stucco made of mud and lime. You may see such houses to-day in some remote parts of the Creole country of Louisiana. As René passed along he spoke with a gay French freedom to the dames and lasses who chanced to be visible. His air would be regarded as violently brigandish in our day. We might even go so far as to think his whole appearance comical. His jaunty cap with the tail that wagged as he walked, his short trousers and leggins of buckskin, and his loose shirt-like tunic drawn in at the waist with a broad belt, gave his strong figure just the dash of wildness suited to the armament with which it was weighted. A heavy gun lay in the hollow of his shoulder, under which hung an otter-skin bullet pouch with its clear powder horn and white bone charger. In his belt were 2 huge flint-lock pistols and a long case-knife. "Bonjour, Ma'm'selle Adrienne," he cheerily called, waving his free hand in greeting to a small, dark lass, standing on the step of a veranda and indolently swinging a broom. "Comment allez-vous aujourd'hui?" Je me porte très bien, merci, Monsieur René, was the quick response. Et vous? Oh, I'm as lively as a cricket. Going a-hunting? No, just up here a little way. Just on business. Up to Monsieur Roussillon's for a moment. Yes, the girl responded in a tone indicative of something very like spleen. Yes, undoubtedly, Monsieur de Ronville. Your business there seems quite pressing of late. I have noticed your industrious application to that business. Ta-ta, little one, he wheedled, lowering his voice. You mustn't go to making bugbears out of nothing. Bugbears, she retorted. You go on about your business and I'll attend to mine, and she flirted into the house. René laughed under his breath, standing a moment as if expecting her to come out again. But she did not, and he resumed his walk, singing softly, Elle a les joues vermeilles, vermeilles, ma belle petite. But 10 to 1 he was not thinking of Mademoiselle Adrienne Boursier. His mind, however, must have been absorbingly occupied, for in the straight open way he met Father Beret and did not see him until he came nearly bumping against the old man, who stepped aside with astonishing agility and said, Dieu vous bénisse, mon fils. But what is your great hurry? Where can you be going in such happy haste? René did not stop to parley with the priest. He flung some phrase of pleasant greeting back over his shoulder as he trudged on, his heart beginning a tattoo against his ribs when the Roussillon place came in sight, and he took hold of his moustache to pull it, as some men must do in moments of nervousness and bashfulness. If sounds ever have colour, the humming in his ears was of a rosy hue. If thoughts ever exhaled fragrance, his brain overflowed with the sweets of violet and heliotrope. He had in mind what he was going to say when Alice and he should be alone together. It was a pretty speech, he thought, indeed a very thrilling little speech, by the way it stirred his own nerve centres as he conned it over. Madame Roussillon met him at the door in not a very good humour. "Is Mademoiselle Alice here?" he ventured to demand. "Alice? No, she's not here. She's never here just when I want her most. V'là le pique-bois et la grive. See the woodpecker and the robin, eating the cherries, eating every one of them, and that girl running off somewhere instead of staying here and picking them," she railed in answer to the young man's polite inquiry. "I haven't seen her these 4 hours, neither her nor that rascally hunchback Jean. They're up to some mischief, I'll be bound." Madame Roussillon puffed audibly between phrases, but she suddenly became very mild when relieved of her tirade. "Mais entrez," she added in a pleasant tone. "Come in and tell me the news." René's disappointment rushed into his face, but he managed to laugh it aside. "Father Beret has just been telling me," said Madame Roussillon, "that our friend Longhair made some trouble last night. How about it?" René told her what he knew, and added that Longhair would probably never be seen again. "He was shot, no doubt of it," he went on, "and is now being nibbled by fish and turtles. We tracked him by his blood to where he jumped into the Wabash. He never came out." Strangely enough it happened that, at the very time of this chat between Madame Roussillon and René, Alice was bandaging Longhair's wounded leg with strips of her apron. It was under some willows which overhung the bank of a narrow and shallow lagoon or slough, which in those days extended a mile or two back into the country on the farther side of the river. Alice and Jean went over in a pirogue to see if the water lilies haunting a pond there were yet beginning to bloom. They landed at a convenient spot some distance up the little lagoon, made the boat fast by dragging its prow high ashore, and were on the point of setting out across a neck of wet, grassy land to the pond, when a deep grunt, not unlike that of a self-satisfied pig, attracted them to the willows, where they discovered Longhair, badly wounded, weltering in some black mud. His hiding place was cunningly chosen, save that the mire troubled him, letting him down by slow degrees and threatening to engulf him bodily, and he was now too weak to extricate himself. He lifted his head and glared. His face was grimy, his hair matted with mud. Alice, although brave enough and quite accustomed to startling experiences, uttered a cry when she saw those snaky eyes glistening so savagely amid the shadows. But Jean was quick to recognize Longhair. He had often seen him about town, a figure not to be forgotten. "They've been hunting him everywhere," he said in a half whisper to Alice, clutching the skirt of her dress. "It's Longhair, the Indian who stole the brandy. I know him." Alice recoiled a pace or two. "Let's go back and tell 'em," Jean added, still whispering. "They want to kill him. Oncle Jason said so. Come on." He gave her dress a jerk, but she did not move any farther back. She was looking at the blood oozing from a wound in the Indian's leg. "He is shot. He is hurt, Jean. We must help him," she presently said, recovering her self-control, yet still pale. "We must get him out of that bad place." Jean caught Alice's merciful spirit with sympathetic readiness, and showed immediate willingness to aid her. It was a difficult thing to do, but there was a will and of course a way. They had knives with which they cut willows to make a standing place on the mud. While they were doing this they spoke friendly words to Longhair, who understood French a little, and at last they got hold of his arms, tugged, rested, tugged again, and finally managed to help him to a dry place, still under the willows, where he could lie more at ease. Jean carried water in his cap, with which they washed the wound and the stolid, savage face. Then Alice tore up her cotton apron in which she had hoped to bear home a load of lilies, and with the strips bound the wound very neatly. It took a long time, during which the Indian remained silent and apparently quite indifferent. Longhair was a man of superior physique, tall, straight, with the muscles of a Vulcan, and while he lay stretched on the ground half clad and motionless, he would have been a grand model for an heroic figure in bronze. Yet from every lineament there came a strange repelling influence, like that from a snake. Alice felt almost unbearable disgust while doing her merciful task, but she bravely persevered until it was finished. It was now late in the afternoon, and the sun would be setting before they could reach home. "We must hurry back, Jean," Alice said, turning to depart. "It will be all we can do to reach the other side in daylight. I'm thinking that they'll be out hunting for us, too, if we don't move right lively. Come." She gave the Indian another glance when she had taken but a step. He grunted, and held up something in his hand, something that shone with a dull yellow light. It was a small, oval gold locket which she had always worn in her bosom. She sprang and snatched it from his palm. "Thank you," she exclaimed, smiling gratefully. "I'm so glad you found it." The chain by which the locket had hung was broken, doubtless by some movement while dragging Longhair out of the mud, and the lid had sprung open, exposing a miniature portrait of Alice, painted when she was a little child, probably not 2 years old. It was a sweet baby face, archly bright, almost surrounded with a fluff of golden hair. The neck and the upper line of the plump shoulders, with a trace of richly delicate lace and a string of pearls, gave somehow a suggestion of patrician daintiness. Longhair looked keenly into Alice's eyes when she stooped to take the locket from his hand, but said nothing. She and Jean now hurried away, and so vigorously did they paddle the pirogue, that the sky was yet red in the west when they reached home and duly received their expected scolding from Madame Roussillon. Alice sealed Jean's lips as to their adventure, for she had made up her mind to save Longhair if possible, and she felt sure that the only way to do it would be to trust no one but Father Beret. It turned out that Longhair's wound was neither a broken bone nor a cut artery. The flesh of his leg midway between the hip and the knee was pierced, the bullet had bored a neat hole clean through. Father Beret took the case in hand, and with no little surgical skill proceeded to set the big Indian upon his feet again. The affair had to be cleverly managed. Food, medicines, and clothing were surreptitiously borne across the river, a bed of grass was kept fresh under Longhair's back, his wound was regularly dressed, and finally his weapons, a tomahawk, a knife, a strong bow, and a quiver of arrows, which he had hidden on the night of his bold theft, were brought to him. "Now go, and sin no more," said good Father Beret, but he well knew that his words were mere puffs of articulate wind in the ear of the grim and silent savage, who limped away with an air of stately dignity into the wilderness. A load fell from Alice's mind when Father Beret informed her of Longhair's recovery and departure. Day and night the dread lest some of the men should find out his hiding place and kill him had depressed and worried her. And now, when it was all over, there still hovered, like an elusive shadow in her consciousness, a vague, haunting impression of the incident's immense significance as an influence in her life. To feel that she had saved a man from death was a new sensation of itself; but the man and the circumstances were picturesque, they invited imagination, they furnished an atmosphere of romance dear to all young and healthy natures, and somehow stirred her soul with a strange appeal. Longhair's imperturbable calmness, his stolid, immobile countenance, the mysterious reptilian gleam of his shifty black eyes, and the soulless expression always lurking in them kept a fascinating hold on the girl's memory. They blended curiously with the impressions left by the romances she had read in Monsieur Roussillon's mildewed books. Longhair was not a young man, but it would have been impossible to guess near his age. His form and face simply showed long experience and immeasurable vigour. Alice remembered with a shuddering sensation the look he gave her when she took the locket from his hand. It was of but a second's duration, yet it seemed to search every nook of her being with its subtle power. Romancers have made much of their Indian heroes, picturing them as models of manly beauty and nobility, but all fiction must be taken with liberal pinches of salt. The plain truth is that dark savages of the pure blood often do possess the magnetism of perfect physical development and unfathomable mental strangeness, but real beauty they never have. Their innate repulsiveness is so great that, like the snake's charm, it may fascinate; yet an indescribable haunting disgust goes with it. And after all, if Alice had been asked to tell just how she felt toward the Indian she had labored so hard to save, she would promptly have said, "I loathe him, as I do a toad." Nor would Father Beret, put to the same test, have made a substantially different confession. His work, to do which his life went as fuel to fire, was training the souls of Indians for the reception of divine grace; but experience had not changed his first impression of savage character. When he travelled in the wilderness he carried the Word and the Cross, but he was also armed with a gun and 2 good pistols, not to mention a dangerous knife. The rumour prevailed that Father Beret could drive a nail at 60 yards with his rifle, and at 20 snuff a candle with either one of his pistols. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4 of Alice of Old Vincennes by Maurice Thompson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 4. The First Mayor of Vincennes. Governor Abbott probably never so much as heard of the Dame Jeanne of French brandy sent to him by his Creole friend in New Orleans. He had been gone from Vincennes several months when the bateau arrived, having been recalled to Detroit by the British authorities, and he never returned. Meantime, the little post with its quaint cabins and dilapidated blockhouse called Fort Sackville lay sunning drowsily by the river in a blissful state of helplessness from the military point of view. There was no garrison; the 2 or 3 pieces of artillery, abandoned and exposed, gathered rust and cobwebs, while the pickets of the stockade, decaying and loosened in the ground by winter freezes and summer rains, leaned in all directions, a picture of decay and inefficiency. The inhabitants of the town, numbering about 600, lived very much as pleased them, without any regular municipal government, each family its own tribe, each man a law unto himself. Yet for mutual protection they all kept in touch and had certain common rights which were religiously respected and defended faithfully. A large pasturing ground was fenced in where the goats and little black cows of the villagers browsed as one herd, while the patches of wheat, corn, and vegetables were not enclosed at all. A few of the thriftier and more important citizens, however, had separate estates of some magnitude, surrounding their residences, kept up with care, and if the time and place be taken into account, with considerable show of taste. Monsieur Gaspard Roussillon was looked upon as the aristocrat par excellence of Vincennes, notwithstanding the fact that his name bore no suggestion of noble or titled ancestry. He was rich and in a measure educated; moreover, the successful man's patent of leadership, a commanding figure and a suave manner, came always to his assistance when a crisis presented itself. He traded shrewdly, much to his own profit, but invariably with the excellent result that the man, white or Indian, with whom he did business felt himself especially favored in the transaction. By the exercise of firmness, prudence, vast assumption, florid eloquence, and a kindly liberality he had greatly endeared himself to the people, so that in the absence of a military commander he came naturally to be regarded as the chief of the town, Monsieur le Maire. He returned from his extended trading expedition about the middle of July, bringing, as was his invariable rule, a gift for Alice. This time it was a small, thin disk of white flint, with a hole in the centre through which a bearded cord of sinew was looped. The edge of the disk was beautifully notched and the whole surface polished so that it shone like glass, while the beads, made of very small segments of porcupine quills, were variously dyed, making a curiously gaudy show of bright colours. "There now, ma chérie, is something worth 50 times its weight in gold," said Monsieur Roussillon when he presented the necklace to his foster daughter with pardonable self-satisfaction. "It is a sacred charm string given me by an old heathen who would sell his soul for a pint of cheap rum. He solemnly informed me that whoever wore it could not by any possibility be killed by an enemy." Alice kissed Monsieur Roussillon. "It's so curious and beautiful," she said, holding it up and drawing the variegated string through her fingers. Then, with her mischievous laugh, she added, "And I'm glad it is so powerful against one's enemy. I will wear it whenever I go where Adrienne Boursier is, see if I don't." "Is she your enemy? What's up between you and la petite Adrienne, eh?" Monsieur Roussillon lightly demanded. "You were always the best of good friends, I thought. What's happened?" "Oh, we are good friends," said Alice quickly. "Very good friends indeed. I was but chaffing." "Good friends, but enemies. That's how it is with women. Who's the young man that's caused the coolness? I could guess, maybe." He laughed and winked knowingly. "May I be so bold as to name him at a venture?" "Yes, if you'll be sure to mention Monsieur René de Ronville," she gaily answered. "Who but he could work Adrienne up into a perfect green mist of jealousy?" "He would need an accomplice, I should imagine. A young lady of some beauty, and a good deal of heartlessness." "Like whom, for example?" and she tossed her bright head. "Not me, I'm sure." "Oh, like every pretty maiden in the whole world, ma petite coquette. They're all alike as peas, cruel as blue jays, and as sweet as apple blossoms." He stroked her hair clumsily with his large hand, as a heavy and roughly fond man is apt to do, adding in an almost serious tone, "But my little girl is better than most of them, not a foolish mischief maker, I hope." Alice was putting her head through the string of the beads and letting the translucent white disk fall into her bosom. "It's time to change the subject," she said. "Tell me what you have seen while away. I wish I could go far off and see things. Have you been to Detroit, Quebec, Montreal?" "Yes, I've been to all. A long, hard journey, but reasonably profitable. You shall have a goodly dot when you get married, my child." "And did you attend any parties and balls?" she inquired quickly, ignoring his concluding remark. "Tell me about them. How do the fine ladies dress? And do they wear their hair high, with great big combs? Do they have long skirts and—" "Hold up, you double-tongued chatterbox," he interrupted. "I can't answer 40 questions at once. Yes, I danced till my legs ached with women old and girls young. But how could I remember how they were dressed and what their style of coiffure was? I know that silk rustled and there was a perfume of eau de Cologne and mignonette, and my heart expanded and blazed while I whirled like a top with a sweet lady in my arms." "Yes, you must have cut a ravishing figure," interpolated Madame Roussillon with emphatic disapproval, her eyes snapping. "A bull in a lace shop. How delighted the ladies must have been! Never saw such blushing faces and burning glances. Such fluttering breasts, such—" "Big braggart!" Madame Roussillon broke in contemptuously. "It's a piastre to a sou that you stood gawping in through a window while gentlemen and ladies did the dancing. I can imagine how you looked, I can." And with this she took her prodigious bulk at a waddling gait out of the room. "I remember how you danced, even when you were not clumsy as a pig on ice," she shrieked back over her shoulder. "Parbleu! True enough, my dear," he called after her. "I should think you could. You mind how we used to trip it together? You were the prettiest dancer of them all, and the young fellows all went to the swords about you." "But tell me more," Alice insisted. "I want to know all about what you saw in the great towns, in the fine houses, how the ladies looked, how they acted, what they said, the dresses they wore, how—" "Ciel! You will split my ears, child. Can't you fill my pipe and bring it to me with a coal on it? Then I'll try to tell you what I can," he cried, assuming a humorously resigned air. "Perhaps if I smoke I can remember everything." Alice gladly ran to do what he asked. Meantime Jean was out on the gallery blowing a flute that Monsieur Roussillon had brought him from Quebec. The pipe well filled and lighted apparently did have the effect to steady and encourage Monsieur Roussillon's memory, or if not his memory, then his imagination, which was of that fervid and liberal sort common to natives of the Midi, and which has been exquisitely depicted by the late Alphonse Daudet in Tartarin and Bompard. He leaned far back in a strong chair, with his massive legs stretched at full length, and gazed at the roof poles while he talked. He sympathized fully in his crude way with Alice's lively curiosity, and his affection for her made him anxious to appease her longing after news from the great outside world. If the sheer truth must come out, however, he knew precious little about that world, especially the polite part of it in which thrived those femininities so dear to the heart of an isolated and imaginative girl. Still, as he too lived in Arcadia, there was no great effort involved when he undertook to blow a dreamer's flute. In the first place, he had not been in Quebec or Montreal during his absence from home. Most of the time had been spent disposing of pelts and furs at Detroit and in extending his trading relations with other posts; but what mattered a trifling want of facts when his meridional fancy once began to warm up? A smattering of social knowledge gained at first hand in his youthful days in France while he was a student whose parents fondly expected him to conquer the world came to his aid, and besides he had saturated himself all his life with poetry and romance. Scudéry, Scarron, Prévost, Madame Lafayette, and Calprenède were the chief sources of his information touching the life and manners, morals and gaieties of people who, as he supposed, stirred the surface of that resplendent and far-off ocean called society. Nothing suited him better than to smoke a pipe and talk about what he had seen and done, and the less he had really seen and done the more he had to tell. His broad, almost over-virile, kindly and contented face beamed with the warmth of wholly imaginary recollections, while he recounted with minute circumstantiality to the delighted Alice his gallant adventures in the crowded and brilliant ballrooms of the French Canadian towns. The rolling burr of his bass voice, deep and resonant, gave force to the improvised descriptions. Madame Roussillon heard the heavy booming and presently came softly back into the door from the kitchen to listen. She leaned against the facing in an attitude of ponderous attention, a hand on her bulging hip. She could not suppress her unbounded admiration of her liege lord's manly physique, and jealous to fierceness as she was of his experiences so eloquently and picturesquely related, her woman's nature took fire with enjoyment of the scenes described. This is the mission of the poet and the romancer: to sponge out of existence for a time the stiff, refractory, and unlovely realities, and give in their place a scene of ideal mobility and charm. The two women revelled in Gaspard Roussillon's revelations. They saw the brilliant companies, the luxurious surroundings, heard the rustle of brocade and the fine flutter of laces, the hum of sweet voices, breathed in the wafts of costly perfumeries, looked on while the dancers whirled and flickered in the confusion of lights, and over all and through all poured and vibrated such ravishing music as only the southern imagination could have conjured up out of nothing. Alice was absolutely charmed. She sat on a low wooden stool and gazed into Gaspard Roussillon's face with dilating eyes in which burned that rich and radiant something we call a passionate soul. She drank in his flamboyant stream of words with a thirst which nothing but experience could ever quench. He felt her silent applause and the admiring involuntary absorption that possessed his wife. The consciousness of his elementary magnetism augmented the flow of his fine descriptions, and he went on and on, until the arrival of Father Beret put an end to it all. The priest, hearing of Monsieur Roussillon's return, had come to inquire about some friends living at Detroit. He took luncheon with the family, enjoying the downright refreshing collation of broiled birds, onions, meal cakes, and claret, ending with a dish of blackberries and cream. Monsieur Roussillon seized the first opportunity to resume his successful romancing, and presently, in the midst of the meal, began to tell Father Beret about what he had seen in Quebec. "By the way," he said with expansive casualness in his voice, "I called upon your old-time friend and coadjutor, Father Sébastien, while up there. A noble old man. He sent you 1,000 good messages. Was mightily delighted when I told him how happy and hale you have always been here. And you should have seen his dear old eyes, full of loving tears. He would walk 100 miles to see you, he said, but never expected to in this world. Blessings, blessings upon dear Father Beret, was what he murmured in my ear when we were parting. He says that he will never leave Quebec until he goes to his home above. Ah!" The way in which Monsieur Roussillon closed his little speech, his large eyes upturned, his huge hands clasped in front of him, was very effective. "I am under many obligations, my son," said Father Beret, "for what you tell me. It was good of you to remember my dear old friend, and to go to him for his loving messages to me. I am very, very thankful. Help me to another drop of wine, please." Now, the extraordinary feature of the situation was that Father Beret had known positively for nearly 5 years that Father Sebastian was dead and buried. "Ah, yes," Monsieur Roussillon continued, pouring the claret with one hand and making a pious gesture with the other, "the dear old man loves you and prays for you. His voice quavers whenever he speaks of you. Doubtless he made his old joke to you about the birthmark on my shoulder," said Father Beret after a moment of apparently thoughtful silence. "He may have said something about it in a playful way, eh?" "True, true. Why, yes, he surely mentioned the same," assented Monsieur Roussillon, his face assuming an expression of confused memory. "It was something sly and humorous, I mind, but it just escapes my recollection. A right jolly old boy is Father Sébastien. Indeed, very amusing at times." "At times, yes," said Father Beret, who had no birthmark on his shoulder, and had never had one there, or on any other part of his person. "How strange!" Alice remarked. "I, too, have a mark on my shoulder, a pink spot, just like a small 5-petalled flower. We must be of kin to each other, Father Beret." The priest laughed. "If our marks are alike, that would be some evidence of kinship," he said. "But what shape is yours, father?" "I've never seen it," he responded. "Never seen it? Why?" "Well, it's absolutely invisible," and he chuckled heartily, meantime glancing shrewdly at Monsieur Roussillon out of the tail of his eye. "It's on the back part of his shoulder," quickly spoke up Monsieur Roussillon, "and you know priests never use looking glasses. The mark is quite invisible, therefore, so far as Father Beret is concerned." "You never told me of your birthmark before, my daughter," said Father Beret, turning to Alice with sudden interest. "It may some day be good fortune to you." "Why so, father?" "If your family name is really Tarleton, as you suppose from the inscription on your locket, the birthmark, being of such singular shape, would probably identify you. It is said that these marks run regularly in families. With the miniature and the distinguishing birthmark, you have enough to make a strong case, should you once find the right Tarleton family." "You talk as they write in novels," said Alice. "I've read about such things in them. Wouldn't it be grand if I should turn out to be some great personage in disguise?" The mention of novels reminded Father Beret of that terrible book Manon Lescaut, which he last saw in Alice's possession, and he could not refrain from mentioning it in a voice that shuddered. "Rest easy, Father Beret," said Alice. "That is one novel I have found wholly distasteful to me. I tried to read it, but could not do it. I flung it aside in utter disgust. You and Mother Roussillon are welcome to hide it deep as a well, for all I care. I don't enjoy reading about low, vile people and hopeless unfortunates. I like sweet and lovely heroines and strong, high-souled, brave heroes." "Read about the blessed saints, then, my daughter. You will find in them the true heroes and heroines of this world," said Father Beret. Monsieur Roussillon changed the subject, for he always somehow dreaded to have the good priest fall into the strain of argument he was about to begin. A stray sheep, no matter how refractory, feels a touch of longing when it hears the shepherd's voice. Monsieur Roussillon was a Catholic, but a straying one, who avoided the confessional and often forgot mass. Still, with all his reckless independence, and with all his outward show of large and breezy self-sufficiency, he was not altogether free from the hold that the Church had laid upon him in childhood and youth. Moreover, he was fond of Father Beret, and had done a great deal for the little church of St. Xavier and the mission it represented, but he distinctly desired to be let alone while he pursued his own course, and he had promised the dying woman who gave Alice to him that the child should be left as she was, a Protestant, without undue influence to change her from the faith of her parents. This promise he had kept with stubborn persistence, and he meant to keep it as long as he lived. Perhaps the very fact that his innermost conscience smote him with vague yet telling blows at times for this departure from the strict religion of his fathers may have intensified his resistance of the influence constantly exerted upon Alice by Father Beret and Madame Roussillon to bring her gently but surely to the Church. Perverseness is a force to be reckoned with in all original characters. A few weeks had passed after Monsieur Roussillon's return when that big-hearted man took it into his head to celebrate his successful trading ventures with a moonlight dance, given without reserve to all the inhabitants of Vincennes. It was certainly a democratic function that he contemplated, and motley to a most picturesque extent. René de Ronville called upon Alice a day or two previous to the occasion, and duly engaged her as his partenaire; but she insisted upon having the engagement guarded in her behalf by a condition so obviously fanciful that he accepted it without argument. "If my wandering knight should arrive during the dance, you promise to stand aside and give place to him?" she stipulated. "You promise that? You see, I'm expecting him all the time. I dreamed last night that he came on a great bay horse, and stooping, whirled me up behind the saddle, and away we went." There was a childish, half-bantering air in her look, but her voice sounded earnest and serious, notwithstanding its delicious timbre of suppressed playfulness. "You promise me?" she insisted. "Oh, I promise to slink away into a corner and chew my thumb the moment he comes," René eagerly assented. "Of course I'm taking a great risk, I know, for lords and barons and knights are very apt to appear suddenly in a place like this." "You may banter and make light if you want to," she said, pouting admirably. "I don't care. All the same, the laugh will jump to the other corner of your mouth, see if it doesn't. They say that what a person dreams about and wishes for and waits for and believes in will come true sooner or later." "If that's so," said René, "you and I will get married, for I've dreamed it every night of the year, wished for it, waited for it, and believed in it, and—" It was a madly sudden rush. He made it on an impulse quite irresistible, as hypnotized persons are said to do in response to the suggestion of the hypnotist, and his heart was choking his throat before he could end his speech. Alice interrupted him with a hearty burst of laughter. "A very pretty twist you give to my words, I must declare," she said, "but not new by any means. Little Adrienne Boursier could tell you that. She says that you have vowed to her over and over that you dream about her, and wish for her, and wait for her, precisely as you have just said to me." René's brown face flushed to the temples, partly with anger, partly with the shock of mingled surprise and fear. He was guilty, and the guilt showed in his eyes and paralyzed his tongue, so that he sat there before Alice with his under jaw sagging ludicrously. "Don't you rather think, Monsieur René de Ronville," she presently added in a calmly advisory tone, "that you had better quit trying to say such foolish things to me, and just be my very good friend? If you don't, I do, which comes to the same thing. What's more, I won't be your partenaire at the dance unless you promise me on your word of honor that you will dance 2 dances with Adrienne to every one that you have with me. Do you promise?" He dared not oppose her outwardly, although in his heart resistance amounted to furious revolt and riot. "I promise anything you ask me to," he said resignedly, almost sullenly. "Anything for you." "Well, I ask nothing whatever on my own account," Alice quickly replied. "But I do tell you firmly that you shall not maltreat little Adrienne Boursier and remain a friend of mine. She loves you, René de Ronville, and you have told her that you love her. If you are a man worthy of respect you will not desert her. Don't you think I am right?" Like a singed and crippled moth vainly trying to rise once again to the alluring yet deadly flame, René de Ronville essayed to break out of his embarrassment and resume equal footing with the girl so suddenly becoming his commanding superior; but the effort disclosed to him as well as to her that he had fallen to rise no more. In his abject defeat he accepted the terms dictated by Alice, and was glad when she adroitly changed her manner and tone in going on to discuss the approaching dance. "Now let me make one request of you," he demanded after a while. "It's a small favor. May I ask it?" "Yes, but I don't grant it in advance." "I want you to wear, for my sake, the buff gown which they say was your grandmother's." "No, I won't wear it." "But why, Alice?" "None of the other girls have anything like such a dress. It would not be right for me to put it on and make them all feel that I had taken the advantage of them, just because I could. That's why." "But then none of them is beautiful and educated like you," he said. "You'll outshine them anyway." "Save your compliments for poor pretty little Adrienne," she firmly responded. "I positively do not wish to hear them. I have agreed to be your partenaire at this dance of Papa Roussillon's, but it is understood between us that Adrienne is your sweetheart. I am not, and I am not going to be either. So for your sake and Adrienne's, as well as out of consideration for the rest of the girls who have no fine dresses, I am not going to wear the buff brocade gown that belonged to Papa Roussillon's mother long ago. I shall dress just as the rest do." It is safe to say that René de Ronville went home with a troublesome bee in his bonnet. He was not a bad-hearted fellow. Many a right good young man, before him and since, has loved an Adrienne and been dazzled by an Alice. A violet is sweet, but a rose is the garden's queen. The poor youthful frontiersman ought to have been stronger; but he was not, and what have we to say? As for Alice, since having a confidential talk with Adrienne Boursier recently, she had come to realize what Monsieur Roussillon meant when he said, "But my little girl is better than most of them, not a foolish mischief maker, I hope." She saw through the situation with a quick understanding of what Adrienne might suffer should René prove permanently fickle. The thought of it aroused all her natural honesty and serious nobleness of character, which lay deep under the almost hoydenish levity usually observable in her manner. Crude as her sense of life's larger significance was, and meagre as had been her experience in the things which count for most in the sum of a young girl's existence under fair circumstances, she grasped intuitively the gist of it all. The dance did not come off. It had to be postponed indefinitely on account of a grave change in the political relations of the little post. A day or two before the time set for that function, a rumor ran through the town that something of importance was about to happen. Father Gibault, at the head of a small party, had arrived from Kaskaskia, far away on the Mississippi, with the news that France and the American colonies had made common cause against the English in the great war of which the people of Vincennes neither knew the cause nor cared a straw about the outcome. It was Oncle Jason who came to the Roussillon place to tell Monsieur Roussillon that he was wanted at the River House. Alice met him at the door. "Come in, Oncle Jason," she cheerily said. "You are getting to be a stranger at our house lately. Come in. What news do you bring? Take off your cap, and rest your hair, Oncle Jason." The scalpless old fighter chuckled raucously, and bowed to the best of his ability. He not only took off his queer cap, but looked into it with a startled gaze, as if he expected something infinitely dangerous to jump out and seize his nose. "1,000 thanks, ma'amselle," he presently said. "Will ye please tell Monsieur Roussillon that I would wish to see him? Yes, Oncle Jason. But first, be seated, and let me offer you just a drop of eau-de-vie. Some that Papa Roussillon brought back with him from Quebec. He says it's old and fine." She poured him a full glass, then setting the bottle on a little stand, went to find Monsieur Roussillon. While she was absent, Oncle Jason improved his opportunity to the fullest extent. At least 3 additional glasses of the brandy went the way of the first. He grinned atrociously and smacked his corrugated lips, but when Gaspard Roussillon came in, the old man was sitting at some distance from the bottle and glass, gazing indifferently out across the veranda. He told his story curtly. Father Gibault, he said, had sent him to ask Monsieur Roussillon to come to the river house, as he had news of great importance to communicate. "Ah, well, Oncle Jason, we'll have a nip of brandy together before we go," said the host. "Why, yes, just one again, the broilin' weather," assented Oncle Jason. "I don't mind just one." "A very rich friend of mine in Quebec gave me this brandy, Oncle Jason," said Monsieur Roussillon, pouring the liquor with a grand flourish, "and I thought of you as soon as I got it. Now, says I to myself, if any man knows good brandy when he tastes it, it's Oncle Jason, and I'll give him a good chance at this bottle, just the first of all my friends." "It surely is delicious," said Oncle Jason. "Very delicious." He spoke French with a curious accent, having spent long years with English-speaking frontiersmen in the Carolinas and Kentucky, so that their lingo had become his own. As they walked side by side down the way to the river house, they looked like typical extremes of rough, sunburned, and weather-tanned manhood. Oncle Jason, a wizened, diminutive scrap, wrinkled and odd in every respect; Gaspard Roussillon, towering 6'2", wide-shouldered, massive, lumbering, muscular, a giant with long curling hair and a superb beard. They did not know that they were going down to help dedicate the great Northwest to freedom. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of Alice of Old Vincennes by Maurice Thompson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 5. Father Gibault. Great movements in the affairs of men are like tides of the seas, which reach and affect the remotest and quietest nooks and inlets, imparting a thrill and a swell of the general motion. Father Gibault brought the wave of the American Revolution to Vincennes. He was a simple missionary, but he was, besides, a man of great worldly knowledge and personal force. Colonel George Rogers Clarke made Father Gibault's acquaintance at Kaskaskia, when the fort and its garrison surrendered to his command, and quickly discerning the fine qualities of the priest's character, sent him to the post on the Wabash to win over its people to the cause of freedom and independence. Nor was the task assumed a hard one, as Father Gibault probably well knew before he undertook it. A few of the leading men of Vincennes, presided over by Gaspard Roussillon, held a consultation at the river house, and it was agreed that a mass meeting should be called bringing all of the inhabitants together in the church, for the purpose of considering the course to be taken under the circumstances made known by Father Gibault. Oncle Jason constituted himself an executive committee of one to stir up a noise for the occasion. It was a great day for Vincennes. The volatile temperament of the French frontiersmen bubbled over with enthusiasm at the first hint of something new and revolutionary in which they might be expected to take part. Without knowing in the least what it was that Father Gibault and Oncle Jason wanted of them, they were all in favor of it at a venture. René de Ronville, being an active and intelligent young man, was sent about through the town to let everybody know of the meeting. In passing, he stepped into the cabin of Father Beret, who was sitting on the loose puncheon floor, with his back turned toward the entrance, and so absorbed in trying to put together a great number of small paper fragments that he did not hear or look up. "Are you not going to the meeting, Father?" René bluntly demanded. In the hurry that was on him, he did not remember to be formally polite, as was his usual habit. The old priest looked up with a startled face. At the same time he swept the fragments of paper together, and clutched them hard in his right hand. "Yes, yes, my son. Yes, I am going. But the time has not yet come for it, has it?" he stammered. "Is it late?" He sprang to his feet, and appeared confused, as if caught in doing something very improper. René wondered at this unusual behavior, but merely said, "I beg pardon, Father Beret, I did not mean to disturb you," and went his way. Father Beret stood for some minutes as if dazed, then squeezed the paper fragments into a tight ball, just as they were when he took them from under the floor some time before René came in, and put it in his pocket. A little later he was kneeling, as we have seen him once before, in silent yet fervent prayer, his clasped hands lifted toward the crucifix on the wall. "Jésus, give me strength to hold on and do my work," he murmured beseechingly, "and oh, free thy poor servant from bitter temptation." Father Gibault had come prepared to use his eloquence upon the excitable Creoles, and with considerable cunning he addressed a motley audience at the church, telling them that an American force had taken Kaskaskia and would henceforth hold it; that France had joined hands with the Americans against the British, and that it was the duty of all Frenchmen to help uphold the cause of freedom and independence. "I come," said he, "directly from Colonel George Rogers Clarke, a noble and brave officer of the American army, who told me the news that I have brought to you. He sent me here to say to you that if you will give allegiance to his government you shall be protected against all enemies and have the full freedom of citizens. I think you should do this without a moment's hesitation, as I and my people at Kaskaskia have already done. But perhaps you would like to have a word from your distinguished fellow citizen, M. Gaspard Roussillon. Speak to your friends, my son; they will be glad to take counsel of your wisdom." There was a stir and a craning of necks. M. Roussillon presently appeared near the little chancel, his great form towering majestically. He bowed and waved his hand, with the air of one who accepts distinction as a matter of course. Then he took his big silver watch and looked at it. He was the only man in Vincennes who owned a watch, and so the incident was impressive. Father Gibault looked pleased, and already a murmur of applause went through the audience. M. Roussillon stroked the bulging crystal of the timepiece with a circular motion of his thumb, and bowed again, clearing his throat resonantly, his face growing purplish above his beard. "Good friends," he said, "what France does all high-class Frenchmen applaud." He paused for a shout of approbation, and was not disappointed. "The other name for France is glory," he added, "and all true Frenchmen love both names. I am a true Frenchman," and he struck his breast a resounding blow with the hand that still held the watch. A huge horn button on his buckskin jerkin came in contact with the crystal, and there was a smash, followed by a scattered tinkling of glass fragments. All Vincennes stood breathless, contemplating the irreparable accident. M. Roussillon had lost the effect of a great period in his speech, but he was quick. Lifting the watch to his ear, he listened a moment with superb dignity, then slowly elevating his head and spreading his free hand over his heart, he said, "The faithful timepiece still tells off the seconds, and the loyal heart of its owner still throbs with patriotism." Oncle Jason, who stood in front of the speaker, swung his shapeless cap as high as he could and yelled like a savage. Then the crowd went wild for a time. "Vive la France! À bas l'Angleterre!" everybody shouted at the top of his voice. "What France does, we all do," continued M. Roussillon when the noise subsided. "France has clasped hands with George Washington and his brave compatriots. So do we." "Vive George Washington!" shrieked Oncle Jason in a piercing treble, tiptoeing and shaking his cap recklessly under M. Roussillon's nose. The orator winced and jerked his head back, but nobody saw it, save perhaps Father Gibault, who laughed heartily. Great sayings come suddenly, unannounced and unexpected. They have the mysterious force of prophetic accident combined with happy economy of phrasing. The Southern blood in M. Roussillon's veins was effervescing upon his brain. His tongue had caught the fine freedom and abandon of inspired oratory. He towered and glowed. Words fell melodiously from his lips. His gestures were compelling, his visage magnetic. In conclusion he said, "Frenchmen, America is the garden spot of the world, and will one day rule it as did Rome of old. Where freedom makes her home, there is the center of power." It was in a little log church on the verge of a hummock overlooking a marshy wild meadow. Westward for 2,000 miles stretched the unbroken prairies, woods, mountains, deserts, reaching to the Pacific. Southward for 1,000 miles rolled the green billows of the wilderness to the warm Gulf shore. Northward to the Pole and eastward to the thin fringe of settlements beyond the mountains, all was houseless solitude. If the reader should go to Vincennes today, and walk southward along Second Street to its intersection with Church Street, the spot then underfoot would be probably very near where Monsieur Roussillon stood while uttering his great sentence. Mind you, the present writer does not pretend to know the exact site of old St. Xavier Church. If it could be fixed beyond doubt, the spot should have an imperishable monument of Indiana stone. When Monsieur Roussillon ceased speaking, the audience again exhausted its vocal resources. And then Father Gibault called upon each man to come forward and solemnly pledge his loyalty to the American cause. Not one of them hesitated. Meantime, a woman was doing her part in the transformation of Post Vincennes from a French-English picket to a full-fledged American fort and town. Madame Godert, finding out what was about to happen, fell to work making a flag in imitation of that under which George Washington was fighting. Alice chanced to be in the Godert home at the time and joined enthusiastically in the sewing. It was an exciting task. Their fingers trembled while they worked, and the thread, heavily coated with beeswax, squeaked as they drew it through the cloth. "We shall not be in time," said Madame Godert. "I know we shall not. Everything hinders me. My thread breaks or gets tangled, and my needle's so rusty I can hardly stick it through the cloth. Oh, dear!" Alice encouraged her with both words and work, and they had almost finished when René came with a staff which he had brought from the fort. "Mon Dieu, but we have had a great meeting!" he cried. He was perspiring with excitement and fast walking. Leaning on the staff, he mopped his face with a blue handkerchief. "We heard much shouting and noise," said Madame Godert. "Monsieur Roussillon's voice rose loud above the rest. He roared like a lion." "Ah, he was speaking to us. He was very eloquent," René replied. "But now they are waiting at the fort for the new flag. I have come for it." "It is ready," said Madame Godert. With flying fingers, Alice sewed it to the staff. "Voici!" she cried. "Vive la République Américaine!" She lifted the staff and let the flag droop over her from head to foot. "Give it to me," said René, holding forth a hand for it, "and I'll run to the fort with it." "No," said Alice, her face suddenly lighting up with resolve. "No, I am going to take it myself," and without a moment's delay off she went. René was so caught by surprise that he stood gazing after her until she passed behind a house, where the way turned, the shining flag rippling around her, and her moccasins twinkling as she ran. At the blockhouse, awaiting the moment when the symbol of freedom should rise like a star over old Vincennes, the crowd had picturesquely broken into scattered groups. Alice entered through a rent in the stockade, as that happened to be a shorter route than through the gate, and appeared suddenly almost in their midst. It was a happy surprise, a pretty and catching spectacular apparition of a sort to be thoroughly appreciated by the lively French fancy of the audience. The men caught the girl's spirit, or it caught them, and they made haste to be noisy. "V'là, v'là, la petite Alice et la bannière de George Washington!" "Look, look, little Alice and George Washington's flag!" shouted Oncle Jason. He put his wiry little legs through a sort of pas de zephyr, and winked at himself with concentrated approval. All the men danced around and yelled till they were hoarse. By this time René had reached Alice's side, but she did not see him. She ran into the blockhouse and climbed up a rude ladder-way. Then she appeared on the roof, still accompanied by René, and planted the staff in a crack of the slabs, where it stood bravely up, the colours floating free. She looked down and saw Monsieur Roussillon, Father Gibault, and Father Beret grouped in the centre of the area. They were waving their hands aloft at her, while a bedlam of voices sent up applause which went through her blood like strong wine. She smiled radiantly, and a sweet flush glowed in her cheeks. No one of all that wild crowd could ever forget the picture sketched so boldly at that moment when, after planting the staff,
Alice stepped back a space and stood strong and beautiful against the soft blue sky. She glanced down first, then looked up, her arms folded across her bosom. It was a pose as unconsciously taken as that of a bird, and the grace of it went straight to the hearts of those below. She turned about to descend, and for the first time saw that René had followed her. His face was beaming. "What a girl you are!" he exclaimed in a tone of exultant admiration. "Never was there another like you." Alice walked quickly past him without speaking, for down in the space where some women were huddled aside from the crowd looking on she had seen little Adrienne Boursier. She made haste to descend. Now that her impulsively chosen enterprise was completed her boldness deserted her, and she slipped out through a dilapidated postern outside the crowd. On her right was the river, while southward before her lay a great flat plain, beyond which rose some hillocks covered with forest. The sun blazed between masses of slowly drifting clouds that trailed creeping fantastic shadows across the marshy waste. Alice walked along under cover of the slight land-swell which then, more plainly marked than it is now, formed the contour line of hummock upon which the fort and village stood. A watery swale grown full of tall aquatic weeds meandered parallel with the bluff, so to call it, and there was a soft melancholy whispering of wind among the long blades and stems. She passed the church and Father Beret's hut, and continued for some distance in the direction of that pretty knoll upon which the cemetery is at present so tastefully kept. She felt shy now, as if to run away and hide would be a great relief. Indeed, so relaxed were her nerves that a slight movement in the grass and cat-tail flags near by startled her painfully, making her jump like a fawn. "Little friend, not be 'fraid," said a guttural voice in broken French. "Little friend, not make noise." At a glance she recognized Long Hair the Indian, rising out of the matted marsh growth. It was a hideous vision of embodied cunning, soullessness, and murderous cruelty. "Not tell white man you see me?" he grunted interrogatively, stepping closer to her. He looked so wicked that she recoiled and lifted her hands defensively. She trembled from head to foot, and her voice failed her. But she made a negative sign, and smiled at him, turning as white as her tanned face could become. In his left hand he held his bow, while in his right he half lifted a murderous-looking tomahawk. "What new flag mean?" he demanded, waving the bow's end toward the fort, and bending his head down close to hers. "Who yonder?" "The great American Father has taken us under his protection," she explained. "We are Big Knives now." It almost choked her to speak. "Ugh! Heap damn fools!" he said with a dark scowl. "Little friend much damn fool." He straightened up his tall form and stood leering at her for some seconds, then added, "Little friend get killed. Scalped, maybe." The indescribable nobility of animal largeness, symmetry, and strength showed in his form and attitude, but the expression of his countenance was absolutely repulsive, cold, hard, beastly. He did not speak again, but turned quickly, and stooping low disappeared like a great brownish red serpent in the high grass, which scarcely stirred as he moved through it. Somehow that day made itself strangely memorable to Alice. She had been accustomed to stirring scenes and sudden changes of conditions; but this was the first time she had ever joined actively in a public movement of importance. Then, too, Long Hair's picturesque and rudely dramatic reappearance affected her imagination with an indescribable force. Moreover, the pathetic situation in the love affair between René and Adrienne had taken hold of her conscience with a disturbing grip. But the shadowy sense of impending events, of which she could form no idea, was behind it all. She had not heard of Brandywine, or Bunker Hill, or Lexington, or Concord, but something like a waft of their significance had blown through her mind. A great change was coming into her idyllic life. She was indistinctly aware of it, as we are sometimes of an approaching storm, while yet the sky is sweetly blue and serene. When she reached home the house was full of people to whom Monsieur Roussillon in the gayest of moods was dispensing wine and brandy. "Vive George Washington!" shouted Uncle Jason as soon as he saw her. And then they all talked at once, saying flattering things about her. Madame Roussillon tried to scold as usual,
but the lively chattering of the guests drowned her voice. "I suppose the American commander will send a garrison here," someone said to Father Gibault, "and repair the fort?" "Probably," the priest replied, "in a very few weeks. Meantime, we will garrison it ourselves." "And we will have Monsieur Roussillon for commander," spoke up René de Ronville, who was standing by. "A good suggestion," assented Father Gibault. "Let us organize at once." Immediately the word was passed that there would be a meeting at the fort that evening for the purpose of choosing a garrison and a commander. Everybody were promptly at the hour set. Monsieur Roussillon was elected captain by acclamation, with René de Ronville as his lieutenant. It was observed that Oncle Jason had resumed his dignity, and that he looked into his cap several times without speaking. Meantime, certain citizens who had been in close relations with Governor Abbott during his stay, quietly slipped out of town, manned a bateau, and went up the river, probably to Ouatanon first, and then to Detroit. Doubtless they suspected that things might soon grow too warm for their comfort. It was thus that Vincennes and Fort Sackville first acknowledged the American government and hoisted the flag which, as long as it floated over the blockhouse, was lightly and lovingly called by every one La Bannière d'Alice Roussillon. Father Gibault returned to Fort Kaskaskia, and a little later Captain Leonard Helm, a jovial man but past the prime of life, arrived at Vincennes with a commission from Colonel Clarke authorizing him to supersede Monsieur Roussillon as commander, and to act as Indian agent for the American government in the department of the Wabash. He was welcomed by the villagers, and at once made himself very pleasing to them by adapting himself to their ways and entering heartily into their social activities. Monsieur Roussillon was absent when Captain Helm and his party came. René de Ronville, nominally in command of the fort, but actually enjoying some excellent grouse shooting with a bell-mouthed old fowling piece on a distant prairie, could not be present to deliver up the post; and as there was no garrison just then visible, Helm took possession without any formalities. "I think, Lieutenant, that you'd better look around through the village and see if you can scare up this Captain What's-his-name," said the new commander to a stalwart young officer who had come with him. "I can't think of these French names without getting my brain in a twist. Do you happen to recollect the captain's name, Lieutenant?" "Yes, sir. Gaspard Roussillon it reads in Colonel Clarke's order; but I am told that he's away on a trading tour," said the young man. "You may be told anything by these hair-tongued parley-voos," Helm remarked. "It won't hurt, anyway, to find out where he lives and make a formal call, just for appearance sake, and to inquire about his health. I wish you would try it, sir, and let me know the result." The lieutenant felt that this was a peremptory order, and turned about to obey promptly. "And I say, Beverly, come back sober, if you possibly can," Helm added in his most genial tone, thinking it a great piece of humor to suggest sobriety to a man whose marked difference from men generally, of that time, was his total abstinence from intoxicating drinks. Lieutenant Fitzhugh Beverly was a Virginian of Virginians. His family had long been prominent in colonial affairs, and boasted a record of great achievements both in peace and in war. He was the only son of his parents, and heir to a fine estate consisting of lands and slaves; but, like many another of the restless young cavaliers of the Old Dominion, he had come in search of adventure over into Kentucky, along the path blazed by Daniel Boone; and when Clarke organized his little army, the young man's patriotic and chivalrous nature leaped at the opportunity to serve his country under so gallant a commander. Beverly was not a mere youth, although yet somewhat under 30. Educated abroad, and naturally of a thoughtful and studious turn, he had enriched his mind far beyond the usual limit among young Americans of the very best class in that time; and so he appeared older than he really was, an effect helped out by his large and powerful form and grave dignity of bearing. Clarke, who found him useful in emergencies, cool, intrepid, daring to a fault, and possessed of excellent judgment, sent him with Helm, hoping that he would offset with his orderly attention to details the somewhat go-as-you-please disposition of that excellent officer. Beverly set out in search of the French commander's house, impressed with no particular respect for him or his office. Somehow, Americans of Anglo-Saxon blood were slow to recognize any good qualities whatever in the Latin Creoles of the West and South. It seemed to them that the Frenchman and the Spaniard were much too apt to equalize themselves socially and matrimonially with Indians and negroes. The very fact that for a century, while Anglo-Americans had been in constant bloody warfare with savages, Frenchmen had managed to keep on easy and highly profitable trading terms with them, tended to confirm the worst implication. "Eat frogs and save your scalp" was a bit of contemptuous frontier humor indicative of what sober judgment held in reserve on the subject. Intent upon his formal mission, Lieutenant Beverley stalked boldly into the enclosure at Roussillon Place, and was met on the gallery by Madame Roussillon, in one of her worst moods. She glared at him with her hands on her hips, her mouth set irritably aslant upward, her eyebrows gathered into a dark knot over her nose. It would be hard to imagine a more forbidding countenance; and for supplementary effect, out popped hunchback Jean to stand behind her, with his big head lying back in the hollow of his shoulders, and his long chin elevated, while he gawped intently up into Beverley's face. "Bonjour, madame," said the lieutenant, lifting his hat and speaking with a pleasant accent. "Would it be agreeable to Captain Roussillon for me to see him a moment?" Despite Beverley's cleverness in using the French language, he had a decided brusqueness of manner and a curt turn of voice not in the least Gallic. True, the soft Virginian intonation marked every word, and his obeisance was as low as if Madame Roussillon had been a queen, but the light French grace was wholly lacking. "What do you want of my husband?" Madame Roussillon demanded. "Nothing unpleasant, I assure you, madame," said Beverley. "Well, he's not at home, monsieur. He's up the river for a few days." She relaxed her stare, untied her eyebrows, and even let her hands fall from her shelf-like hips. "Thank you, madame," said Beverley, bowing again. "I am sorry not to have seen him." As he was turning to go, a shimmer of brown hair streaked with gold struck upon his vision from just within the door. He paused, as if in response to a military command, while a pair of gray eyes met his with a flash. The cabin room was ill lighted, but the crepuscular dimness did not seem to hinder his sight. Beyond the girl's figure a pair of slender swords hung crossed aslant on the wall opposite the low door. Beverley had seen, in the old world galleries, pictures in which the shadowy and somewhat uncertain background thus forced into strongest projection the main figure, yet without clearly defining it. The rough frame of the doorway gave just the rustic setting suited to Alice's costume, the most striking part of which was a grayish short gown ending just above her fringed buckskin moccasins. Around her head she had bound a blue kerchief, a wide corner of which lay over her crown like a loose cap. Her bright hair hung free upon her shoulders in tumbled half curls. As a picture, the figure and its entourage might have been artistically effective; but as Beverley saw it in actual life the first impression was rather embarrassing. Somehow he felt almost irresistibly invited to laugh, though he had never been much given to risibility. The blending, or rather the juxtaposition of extremes, a face, a form immediately witching, and a costume odd to grotesquerie, had made an assault upon his comprehension at once so sudden and so direct that his dignity came near being disastrously broken up. A splendidly beautiful child, comically clad, would have made much the same half delightful, half displeasing impression. Beverley could not stare at the girl, and no sooner had he turned his back upon her than the picture in his mind changed like a scene in a kaleidoscope. He now saw a tall, finely developed figure, and a face delicately oval, with a low, wide forehead, arched brows, a straight, slightly tip-tilted nose, a mouth sweet and full, dimpled cheeks, and a strong chin set above a faultless throat. His imagination, in casting off its first impression, was inclined to exaggerate Alice's beauty and to dwell upon its picturesqueness. He smiled as he walked back to the fort, and even found himself whistling gaily a snatch from a rollicking fiddle tune that he had heard when a boy. End of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of Alice of Old Vincennes by Maurice Thompson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 6. A fencing bout. A few days after Helm's arrival, Monsieur Roussillon returned to Vincennes, and if he was sorely touched in his amour propre by seeing his suddenly acquired military rank and title drop away, he did not let it be known to his fellow citizens. He promptly called upon the new commander, and made acquaintance with Lieutenant Fitzhugh Beverley, who just then was superintending the work of cleaning up an old cannon in the fort and mending some breaks in the stockade. Helm formed a great liking for the big Frenchman, whose breezy freedom of manner and expansive good humour struck him favourably from the beginning. Monsieur Roussillon's ability to speak English with considerable ease helped the friendship along, no doubt. At all events, their first interview ended up with a hearty show of good fellowship, and as time passed they became almost inseparable companions during Monsieur Roussillon's periods of rest from his trading excursions among the Indians. They played cards and brewed hot drinks over which they told marvellous stories, the latest one invariably surpassing all its predecessors. Helm had an eye to business, and turned Monsieur Roussillon's knowledge of the Indians to valuable account, so that he soon had very pleasant relations with most of the tribes within reach of his agents. This gave a feeling of great security to the people of Vincennes. They pursued their narrow agricultural activities with excellent results, and redoubled those social gaieties which, even in hut and cabin under all the adverse conditions of extreme frontier life, were dear to the volatile and genial French temperament. Lieutenant Beverley found much to interest him in the quaint town; but the pièce de résistance was Uncle Jason, who proved to be both fascinating and unmanageable, a hard nut to crack, yet possessing a kernel absolutely original in flavour. Beverley visited him one evening in his hut, it might be better called den, a curiously built thing, with walls of vertical poles set in a quadrangular trench dug in the ground and roofed with grass. Inside and out it was plastered with clay, and the floor of dried mud was as smooth and hard as concrete paving. In one end there was a wide fireplace, grimy with soot, in the other a mere peephole for a window. A wooden bench, a bed of skins, and 2 or 3 stools were barely visible in the gloom. In the doorway Oncle Jason sat whittling a slender billet of hickory into a ramrod for his long flint American rifle. "Mebbe ye know Simon Kenton?" said the old man, after he and Beverley had conversed for a while, "seeing that you are from Kentucky, eh?" "Yes, I do know him well. He's a warm personal friend of mine," said Beverley with quick interest, for it surprised him that Oncle Jason should know anything about Kenton. "Do you know him, Monsieur Jason?" Oncle Jason winked conceitedly and sighted along his rudimentary ramrod to see if it was straight; then, puckering his lips as if on the point of whistling, made an affirmative noise quite impossible to spell. "Well, I'm glad you are acquainted with Kenton," said Beverley. "Where did you and he come together?" Oncle Jason chuckled reminiscently and scratched the skinless cicatrized spot where his scalp had once flourished. "Oh, several places," he answered. "You see that hair hanging there on the wall?" He pointed at a dry wisp dangling under a peg in a log barely visible by the bad light. "Well, that's my scalp. He 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 he!" He snickered, as if the fact were a most enjoyable joke. "Simon Kenton can tell ye about that little affair. The Indians thought I was dead, and they took my hair. But I wasn't dead. I was just a givin' 'em a 'possum act. When they was gone I got up from where I was layin' and trotted off. My head was sore and ventre bleu, but I was mad. All this time he spoke in French, and the English but poorly paraphrases his odd turns of expression. His grimaces and grunts cannot even be hinted. It was a long story as Beverley received it, told scrappily but with a certain rude art. In the end Oncle Jason said with unctuous self-satisfaction, "Accidents will happen. I got my chance at that damned Indian who skinned my head, and I just took a bead on him with my old rifle. I can't shoot much, never could. But I happened to hit him square in the left eye what I shot at, and it was 100 yards. Down he tumbles, and I runs to him and finds my same old scalp a-hangin' to his belt. Well, I lifted off his hair with my knife and untied mine from the belt, and then I had both scalps. You ask Simon Kenton when ye see him. He was along at the same time, and they made him run the gauntlet and pretty nigh beat the life out of him. Ventre bleu!" Beverley now recollected hearing Kenton tell the same grim story by a camp fire in the hills of Kentucky. Somehow it had caught a new spirit in the French rendering, which linked it with the old tales of adventure that he had read in his boyhood, and it suddenly endeared Uncle Jason to him. The rough old scrap of a man and the powerful youth chatted together until sundown, smoking their pipes, each feeling for what was best in the other, half aware that in the future they would be tested together in the fire of wild adventure. Every man is more or less a prophet at certain points in his life. Twilight and moonlight were blending softly when Beverley, on his way back to the fort, departing from a direct course, went along the river side southward to have a few moments of reflective strolling within reach of the water's pleasant murmur and the town's indefinite evening stir. Rich sweetness, the gift of early autumn, was on the air, blowing softly out of a lilac west, and singing in the willow fringe that hung here and there over the bank. On the farther side of the river's wide flow, swollen by recent heavy rains, Beverley saw a pirogue in one end of which a dark figure swayed to the strokes of a paddle. The slender and shallow little craft was bobbing on the choppy waves and taking a zigzag course among floating logs and masses of lighter driftwood, while making slow but certain headway toward the hither bank. Beverley took a bit of punk and a flint and steel from his pocket, relit his pipe, and stood watching the skilful boatman conduct a somewhat dangerous voyage diagonally against the rolling current. It was a shifting hide-and-seek scene, its features appearing and disappearing with the action of the waves and the doubtful light reflected from fading clouds and sky. Now and again the man stood up in his skittish pirogue, balancing himself with care to use a short pole in shoving driftwood out of his way, and more than once he looked to Beverley as if he had plunged headlong into the dark water. The spot, as nearly as it can be fixed, was about 200 yards below where the public road bridge at present spans the Wabash. The bluff was then far different from what it is now, steeper and higher, with less silt and sand between it and the water's edge. Indeed, swollen as the current was, a man could stand on the top of the bank and easily leap into the deep water. At a point near the middle of the river, a great mass of drift logs and sand had long ago formed a barrier which split the stream so that one current came heavily shoreward on the side next the town, and swashed with its muddy foam, making a swirl and eddy just below where Beverley stood. The pirogue rounded the upper angle of this obstruction, not without difficulty, to its crew of one, and swung into the rapid shoreward rush, as was evidently planned for by the steersman, who now paddled against the tide with all his might to keep from being borne too far downstream for a safe landing place. Beverley stood at ease idly and half dreamily looking on, when suddenly something caused a catastrophe which for a moment he did not comprehend. In fact, the man in the pirogue came to grief, as a man in a pirogue is very apt to do, and fairly somersaulted overboard into the water. Nothing serious would have threatened, for the man could swim like an otter, had not a floating half-submerged log thrust up some short stiff stumps of boughs, upon the points of which the man struck heavily and was not only hurt, but had his clothes impaled securely by one of the ugly spears, so that he hung in a helpless position, while the water's motion alternately lifted and submerged him, his arms beating about wildly. When Beverley heard a strangling cry for help, he pulled himself promptly together, flung off his coat, as if by a single motion, and leaped down the bank into the water. He was a swimmer whose strokes counted for all that prodigious strength and excellent training could afford. He rushed through the water with long sweeps, making a semicircle, rounding against the current so as to swing down upon the drowning man. Less than a half hour later, a rumor by some means spread throughout the town that Father Beret and Lieutenant Beverley were drowned in the Wabash. But when a crowd gathered to verify the terrible news, it turned out to be untrue. Gaspard Roussillon had once more distinguished himself by an exhibition of heroic nerve and muscle. "Ventre bleu! Quel homme!" exclaimed Oncle Jason, when told that Monsieur Roussillon had come up the bank of the Wabash with Lieutenant Beverley under one arm, and Father Beret under the other, both men apparently dead. "Bring them to my house immediately," Monsieur Roussillon ordered as soon as they were restored to consciousness, and he shook himself, as a big wet animal sometimes does, covering everybody near him with muddy water. Then he led the way with melodramatic strides. In justice to historical accuracy, there must be a trifling reform of what appeared on the face of things to be grandly true. Gaspard Roussillon actually dragged Father Beret and Lieutenant Beverley one at a time out of the eddy water and up the steep river bank. That was truly a great feat, but the hero never explained. When men arrived, he was standing between the collapsed forms, panting and dripping. Doubtless he looked just as if he had dropped them from under his arms, and why shouldn't he have the benefit of a great implication? I've saved them both," he roared, from which, of course, the ready Creole imagination inferred the extreme of possible heroic performance. "Bring them to my house immediately," and it was accordingly done. The procession, headed by Monsieur Roussillon, moved noisily, for the French tongue must shake off what comes to it on the thrill of every exciting moment. The only silent Frenchman is a dead one. Father Beret was not only well nigh drowned, but seriously hurt. He lay for a week on a bed in Monsieur Roussillon's house before he could sit up. Alice hung over him night and day, scarcely sleeping or eating until he was past all danger. As for Beverley, he shook off all the effects of his struggle in a little while. Next day he was out, as well and strong as ever, busy with the affairs of his office. Nor was he less happy on account of what the little adventure had cast into his experience. It is good to feel that one has done an unselfish deed, and no young man's heart repels the freshness of what comes to him when a beautiful girl first enters his life. Naturally enough, Alice had some thoughts of Beverley while she was so attentively caring for Father Beret. She had never before seen a man like him, nor had she read of one. Compared with René de Ronville, the best youth of her acquaintance, he was in every way superior. This was too evident for analysis; but referred to the romantic standard taken out of the novels she had read, he somehow failed; and yet he loomed bravely in her vision, not exactly a knight of the class she had most admired, still unquestionably a hero of large proportions. Beverley stepped in for a few minutes every day to see Father Beret, involuntarily lengthening his visit by a sliding ratio as he became better acquainted. He began to enjoy the priest's conversation, with its sly worldly wisdom cropping up through fervid religious sentiments and quaint humour. Alice must have interested him more than he was fully aware of, for his eyes followed her as she came and went, with a curious criticism of her half-savage costume and her springy, dryad-like suppleness, which reminded him of the shyest and gracefulest wild birds, and yet a touch of refinement the subtlest and best showed in all her ways. He studied her as he would have studied a strange, showy, and originally fragrant flower, or a bird of oddly attractive plumage. While she said little to him, or to anyone else in his presence, he became aware of the wilfulness and joyous lightness which played on her nature's changeable surface. He wondered at her influence over Father Beret, whom she controlled apparently without effort. But in due time he began to feel a deeper character, a broader intelligence behind her superficial sauvagerie, and he found that she really had no mean smattering of books in the lighter vein. A little thing happened which further opened his eyes and increased the interest that her beauty and elementary charm of style aroused in him gradually, apace with their advancing acquaintanceship. Father Beret had got well, and returned to his hut and his round of spiritual duties, but Beverley came to Roussillon Place every day all the same. For a wonder Madame Roussillon liked him, and at most times held the scolding side of her tongue when he was present. Jean, too, made friendly advances whenever opportunity afforded. Of course Alice gave him just the frank cordiality of hospitable welcome demanded by frontier conditions. She scarcely knew whether she liked him or not, but he had a treasury of information from which he was enriching her with liberal carelessness day by day. The hungriest part of her mind was being sumptuously banqueted at his expense. Mere intellectual greediness drew her to him. Naturally they soon threw off such troubling formalities as at first rose between them, and began to disclose to each other their true characteristics. Alice found in Beverley a large target for the missiles of her clever and tantalizing perversity. He, in turn, practised a native dignity and an acquired superiority of manner to excellent effect. It was a meeting of Greek with Greek in a new Arcadia. To him, here was Diana, strong, strange, simple, even crude almost to naturalness, yet admirably pure in spirit and imbued with highly womanly aspirations. To her, Beverley represented the great outside area of life. He came to her from Wonderland, beyond the wide circle of houseless woods and prairies. He represented gorgeous cities, teeming parks of fashion, boulevards, salons, halls of social splendor, the theatre, the world of woman's dreams. Now there is an antagonism, vague yet powerful, generated between natures thus cast together from the opposite poles of experience and education, an antagonism practically equivalent to the most vigorous attraction. what one knows the other is but half aware of. Neither knowledge nor ignorance being mutual, there is a scintillation of exchange from opposing vantage grounds, followed by harmless snaps of thunder. Culture and refinement take on airs. It is the deepest artificial instinct of enlightenment to pose, in the presence of naturalness; and there is a certain style of ignorance which attitudinizes before the gate of knowledge. The return to nature has always been the dream of the conventionalized soul, while the simple Arcadian is forever longing for the maddening honey of sophistication. Innate jealousies strike together like flint and steel, dashing off sparks by which nearly everything that life can warm its core withal is kindled and kept burning. What I envy in my friend, I store for my best use. I thrust and parry, not to kill, but to learn my adversary's superior feints and guards. And this hint of sword play leads back to what so greatly surprised and puzzled Beverley one day when he chanced to be examining the pair of colichemards on the wall. He took one down, and handling it with the indescribable facility possible to none save a practical swordsman, remarked, "There's a world of fascination in these things. I like nothing better than a bout at fencing. Does your father practice the art?"
"I have no father, no mother," she quickly said. "But good Papa Roussillon does like a little exercise with the colichemard."
"Well, I'm glad to hear it. I shall ask to teach him a trick or two," Beverley responded in the lightest mood. "When will he return from the woods?"
"I can't tell you. He's very irregular in such matters," she said.
Then, with a smile half banter and half challenge, she added,
"If you are really dying for some exercise, you shall not have to wait for him to come home, I assure you, Monsieur Beverley."
"Oh, it's Monsieur de Ronville, perhaps, that you will offer up as a victim to my skill and address," he slyly returned, for he was suspecting that a love affair in some stage of progress lay between her and René. She blushed violently, but quickly overcoming a combined rush of surprise and anger, added, with an emphasis as charming as it was unexpected,
"I myself am, perhaps, swordsman enough to satisfy the impudence and vanity of Monsieur Beverley, lieutenant in the American army."
"Pardon me, mademoiselle. Forgive me, I beg of you," he exclaimed, earnestly modulating his voice to sincerest beseechment. "I really did not mean to be impudent, nor—" Her vivacity cleared with a merry laugh.
"No apologies, I command you," she interposed. "We will have them after I have taught you a fencing lesson."
From a shelf she drew down a pair of foils, and presenting the hilts, bade him take his choice.
"There isn't any difference between them that I know of," she said, and then added archly, "but you will feel better at last when all is over and the sting of defeat tingles through you, if you are conscious of having used every sensible precaution."
He looked straight into her eyes, trying to catch what was in her mind, but there was a bewildering glamour playing across those grey, opal-tinted wells of mystery, from which he could draw only a mischievous smile glint, direct, daring, irresistible. "Well," he said, taking one of the foils, "what do you really mean? Is it a challenge without room for honourable retreat?"
"The time for parley is past," she replied. "Follow me to the battle ground."
She led the way to a pleasant little court in the rear of the cabin's yard, a space between two wings and a vine-covered trellis, beyond which lay a well-kept vineyard and vegetable garden. Here she turned about and faced him, poising her foil with a fine grace.
"Are you ready?"
she inquired. He tried again to force a way into the depths of her eyes with his, but he might as well have attacked the sun; so he stood in a confusion of not very well defined feelings, undecided, hesitating, half expecting that there would be some laughable turn to end the affair.
"Are you afraid, Monsieur Beverley?"
she demanded, after a short waiting in silence. He laughed now, and whipped the air with his foil. "You certainly are not in earnest?" he said interrogatively. "Do you really mean that you want to fence with me?"
"If you think because I'm only a girl you can easily beat me, try it,"
she tauntingly replied, making a level thrust toward his breast. Quick as a flash he parried, and then a merry clinking and twinkling of steel blades kept time to their swift movements. Instantly, by the sure sense which is half sight, half feeling, the sense that guides the expert fencer's hand and wrist, Beverley knew that he had probably more than his match, and in 10 seconds his attack was met by a time thrust in opposition which touched him sharply. Alice sprang far back, lowered her point, and laughed.
Je vous salue, Monsieur Beverley, she cried, with childlike show of delight. Did you feel the button?
Yes, I felt it, he said with frank acknowledgment in his voice. It was cleverly done. Now give me a chance to redeem myself. He began more carefully, and found that she too was on her best mettle. But it was a short bout as before. Alice seemed to give him an easy opening, and he accepted it with a thrust. Then something happened that he did not understand. The point of his foil was somehow caught under his opponent's hilt guard, while her blade seemed to twist around his. At the same time there was a ring and a jerk, the like of which he had never felt before, and he was disarmed, his wrist and fingers aching with the wrench they had received. Of course, the thing was not new, he had been disarmed before. But her trick of doing it was quite a mystery to him, altogether different from any that he had ever seen.
Vous me pardonnerez, monsieur,
she mockingly exclaimed, picking up his weapon and offering the hilt to him.
Here is your sword.
Keep it, he said, folding his arms and trying to look unconcerned. You have captured it fairly. I am at your mercy. Be kind to me. Madame Roussillon and Jean the hunchback, hearing the racket of the foils, had come out to see, and were standing agape.
You ought to be ashamed, Alice,
said the dame in scolding approval of what she had done.
Girls do not fence with gentlemen.
This girl does, said Alice. And with extreme disaster to this gentleman, said Beverley, laughing in a tone of discomfiture and resignation.
Ah, monsieur, there's nothing but disaster where she goes, complained Madame Roussillon. She is a destroyer of everything. Only yesterday she dropped my pink bowl and broke it, the only one I had.
And just to think, said Beverley, what would have been the condition of my heart had we been using rapiers instead of leather-buttoned foils? She would have spitted it through the very centre.
Like enough, replied the dame indifferently. She wouldn't wince either. Not she.
Alice ran into the house with the foils, and Beverley followed. We must try it over again some day soon, he said. I find that you can show me a few points. Where did you learn to fence so admirably? Is Monsieur Roussillon your master?
Indeed he isn't, she quickly replied. He is but a bungling swordsman. My master, but I am not at liberty to tell you who has taught me the little I know.
Well, whoever he is, I should be glad to have lessons from him.
But you'll never get them.
Why?
Because.
A woman's ultimatum.
As good as a man's, she bridled prettily, and sometimes better. At the foils, for example. Vous comprenez, n'est-ce pas?
He laughed heartily. Yes, your point reaches me, he said. But sperat et in suavo victus gladiatur arena, as the old Latin poet wisely remarks. The quotation was meant to tease her.
Yes, Montaigne translated that, or something, in his book, she commented with prompt erudition. I understand it.
Beverley looked amazed. What do you know about Montaigne? He demanded with a blunt brevity amounting to something like gruffness.
Shh, monsieur, not too loud,
she softly protested, looking around to see that neither Madame Roussillon nor Jean had followed them into the main room.
It is not permitted that I read the old book, but they do not hide it from me, because they think I can't make out its dreadful spelling.
She smiled so that her cheeks drew their dimples deep into the delicately tinted pink and brown, where wind and sun and wholesome exercise had set the seal of absolute health, and took from a niche in the logs of the wall a stained and dog-eared volume. He looked, and it was indeed the old saint and sinner, Montaigne. Involuntarily he ran his eyes over the girl from head to foot, comparing her show of knowledge with the outward badges of abject rusticity and even wildness with which she was covered. Well, he said, you are a mystery.
You think it surprising that I can read a book? Frankly, I can't understand half of this one. I read it because, well, just because they want me to read about nothing but sickly old saints and woebegone penitents. I like something lively. What do I care for all that uninteresting religious stuff?
Montaigne is decidedly lively in spots," Beverley remarked. "I shouldn't think you'd particularly enjoy his humours."
I don't care for the book at all," she said, flushing quickly. "Only I seem to learn about the world from it. Sometimes it seems as if it lifted me up high above all this wild, lonely, and tiresome country, so that I can see far off where things are different and beautiful. It is the same with the novels, and they don't permit me to read them either, but all the same I do."
When Beverley, taking his leave, passed through the gate at Roussillon Place, he met René de Ronville going in. It was a notable coincidence that each young man felt something troublesome rise in his throat as he looked into the other's eyes. A week of dreamy autumn weather came on, during which Beverley managed to be with Alice a great deal, mostly sitting on the Roussillon gallery, where the fading vine leaves made fairy whispering, and where the tempered breeze blew deliciously cool from over the distant multicolored woods. The men of Vincennes were gathering their Indian corn early to dry it on the cob for grating into winter meal. Many women made wine from the native grapes and from the sweeter and richer fruit of imported vines. Madame Roussillon and Alice stained their hands a deep purple during the pressing season, and Beverley found himself engaged in helping them handle the juicy crop, while around the overflowing earthen pots the wild bees, wasps, and hornets hummed with an incessant, jarring monotony. Jean the hunchback gathered ample stores of hickory nuts, walnuts, hazel nuts, and pink oak acorns. Indeed, the whole population of the village made a great spurt of industry just before the falling of winter; and presently, when every preparation had been completed for the dreaded cold season, M. Roussillon carried out his long cherished plan and gave a great party at the River House. After the most successful trading experience of all his life he felt irrepressibly liberal. "Let's have one more roaring good time," he said. "That's what life is for." End of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of Alice of Old Vincennes by Maurice Thompson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 7. The Mayor's Party. Beverley was so surprised and confused in his mind by the ease with which he had been mastered at sword-play by a mere girl, that he felt as if just coming out of a dream. In fact, the whole affair seemed unreal, yet so vivid and impressive in all its main features, that he could not emerge from it and look it calmly over from without. His experience with women had not prepared him for a ready understanding and acceptance of a girl like Alice. While he was fully aware of her beauty, freshness, vivacity, and grace, this Amazonian strength of hers, this boldness of spirit, this curious mixture of frontier crudeness and a certain adumbration, so to call it, of patrician sensibilities and aspirations, affected him both pleasantly and unpleasantly. He did not sympathize promptly with her semi-barbaric costume. She seemed not gently feminine as compared with the girls of Virginia and Maryland. He resented her muscular development and her independent disposition. She was far from coarseness, however, and indeed a trace of subtle refinement, although not conventional, imbued her whole character. But why was he thinking so critically about her? Had his selfishness received an incurable shock from the button of her foil? A healthy young man of the right sort is apt to be jealous of his physical prowess. Touch him there, and he will turn the world over to right himself in his own admiration and yours. But to be beaten on his highest ground of virility by a dimple-faced maiden just leaving her teens could not offer Beverley any open way to recoupment of damages. He tried to shake her out of his mind as a bit of pretty and troublesome rubbish, what time he pursued his not very exacting military duties. But the more he shook, the tighter she clung, and the oftener he went to see her. Helm was a good officer in many respects, and his patriotism was of the best. But he liked jolly company, a glass of something strong, and a large share of ease. Detroit lay many miles northeastward across the wilderness, and the English, he thought, would scarcely come so far to attack his little post, especially now that most of the Indians in the intervening country had declared in favor of the Americans. Recently, too, the weather had been favoring him by changing from wet to dry, so that the upper Wabash and its tributaries were falling low and would soon be very difficult to navigate with large bateaux. Very little was done to repair the stockade and dilapidated remnant of a blockhouse. There were no sufficient barracks, a mere shed in one angle serving for quarters, and the old cannon could not have been used to any effect in case of attack. As for the garrison, it was a nominal quantity, made up mostly of men who preferred hunting and fishing to the merest pretence of military duty. Gaspard Roussillon assumed to know everything about Indian affairs and the condition of the English at Detroit. His optimistic eloquence lulled Helm to a very pleasant sense of security. Beverley was not so easy to satisfy, but his suggestions regarding military discipline and a vigorous prosecution of repairs to the blockhouse and stockade were treated with dilatory geniality by his superior officer. The soft wonder of a perfect Indian summer glorified land, river, and sky. Why not dream and bask? Why not drink exhilarating toddies? Meantime, the entertainment to be given by Gaspard Roussillon occupied everybody's imagination to an unusual extent. René de Ronville, remembering but not heeding the doubtful success of his former attempt, went long beforehand to claim Alice as his partenaire; but she flatly refused him, once more reminding him of his obligations to little Adrienne Boursier. He would not be convinced. "You are bound to me," he said. "You promised before, you know, and the party was but put off." "I hold you to it. You are my partenaire, and I am yours. You can't deny that." "No, you are not my partenaire," she firmly said, then added lightly, "Feu mon partenaire, you are dead and buried as my partner at that dance." He glowered in silence for a few moments, then said, "It is Lieutenant Beverley, I suppose?" She gave him a quick, contemptuous look, but turned it instantly into one of her tantalizing smiles. "Do you imagine that?" she demanded. "Imagine it? I know it," he said with a hot flush. "Have I no sense?" "Precious little," she replied with a merry laugh. "You think so. Go to Father Beret, tell him everything, and then ask him what he thinks," she said in a calm, even tone, her face growing serious. There was an awkward silence. She had touched René's vulnerable spot. He was nothing if not a devout Catholic, and his conscience rooted itself in what good Father Beret had taught him. The Church, no matter by what name it goes, Catholic or Protestant, has a saving hold on the deepest inner being of its adherents. No grip is so hard to shake off as that of early religious convictions. The still small voice coming down from the Times, "When shepherds watch their flocks by night," in old Judea, passes through the priest, the minister, the preacher. It echoes in cathedral, church, open-air meeting. It gently and mysteriously imparts to human life the distinctive quality which is the exponent of Christian civilization. Upon the receptive nature of children it makes an impress that forever afterward exhales a fragrance and irradiates a glory for the saving of the nations. Father Beret was the humble, self-effacing, never-tiring agent of good in his community. He preached in a tender sing-song voice the sweet monotonies of his creed and the sublime truths of Christ's code. He was indeed the spiritual father of his people. No wonder René's scowling expression changed to one of abject self-concern when the priest's name was suddenly connected with his mood. The confessional loomed up before the eyes of his conscience, and his knees smote together, spiritually if not physically. "Now," said Alice brusquely, but with sweet and gentle firmness, "go to your fiancée, go to pretty and good Adrienne, and ask her to be your partenaire. Refresh your conscience with a noble draught of duty, and make that dear little girl overflow with joy. Go, René de Ronville." In making over what she said into English, the translation turns out to be but a sonorous paraphrase. Her French was that of a mixed Creole sort, a blending of linguistic elegance and patois impossible to imitate. Like herself, it was beautiful, crude, fascinating, and something in it impressed itself as unimpeachable, despite the broken and incongruous diction. René felt his soul cowering, even slinking; but he fairly maintained a good face, and went away without saying another word. "Ciel, ciel, how beautiful she is!" he thought, as he walked along the narrow street in the dreamy sunshine. "But she is not for me, not for me." He shook himself and tried to be cheerful. In fact, he hummed a Creole ditty, something about "La belle Jeannette qu'a brisé mon cœur." Days passed, and at last the time of the great event arrived. It was a frosty night, clear, sparkling with stars,
a keen breath cutting down from the northwest. Monsieur Roussillon, Madame Roussillon, Alice, and Lieutenant Beverley went together to the river house, whither they had been preceded by almost the entire population of Vincennes. Some fires had been built outside, the crowd proving too great for the building's capacity, as there had to be ample space for the dancers. Merry groups hovered around the flaming logs, while within the house a fiddle sang its simple and ravishing tunes. Everybody talked and laughed. It was a lively racket of clashing voices and rhythmical feet. You would have been surprised to find that Oncle Jason was the fiddler; but there he sat, perched on a high stool in one corner of the large room, sawing away as if for dear life, his head wagging, his elbow leaping back and forth, while his scalpless crown shone like the side of a peeled onion, and his puckered mouth wagged grotesquely from side to side, keeping time to his tuneful scraping. When the Roussillon party arrived it attracted condensed attention. Its importance, naturally of the greatest in the assembled popular mind, was enhanced, as mathematicians would say, to the nth power, by the gown of Alice. It was resplendent indeed in the simple, unaccustomed eyes upon which it flashed with a buff silken glory. Matrons stared at it, maidens gazed with fascinated and jealous vision, men young and old let their eyes take full liberty. It was as if a queen, arrayed in a robe of state, had entered that dingy log edifice, an apparition of dazzling and awe-inspiring beauty. Oncle Jason caught sight of her and snapped his tune short off. The dancers swung together and stopped in confusion; but she, fortified by a woman's strongest bulwark, the sense of resplendency, appeared quite unconscious of herself. Little Adrienne, hanging in blissful delight upon René's strong arm, felt the stir of excitement and wondered what was the matter, being too short to see over the heads of those around her.
What is it? What is it? She cried, tiptoeing and tugging at her companion's sleeve. Tell me, René, tell me, I say.
René was gazing in dumb admiration, into which there swept a powerful anger, like a breath of flame. He recollected how Alice had refused to wear that dress when he had asked her, and now she had it on. Moreover, there she stood beside Lieutenant Beverley, holding his arm, looking up into his face, smiling, speaking to him.
I think you might tell me what has happened, said Adrienne, pouting and still plucking at his arm. I can't see a thing, and you won't tell me.
Oh, it's nothing, he presently answered, rather fretfully. Then he stooped, lowered his voice, and added, It's Mademoiselle Roussillon all dressed up like a bride or something. She's got on a buff silk dress that Monsieur Roussillon's mother had in France.
How beautiful she must look, cried the girl. I wish I could see her.
René put a hand on each side of her slender waist and lifted her high so that her pretty head rose above the crowding people. Alice chanced to turn her face that way just then, and saw the unconventional performance. Her eyes met those of Adrienne, and she gave a nod of smiling recognition. It was a rose beaming upon a gillyflower. Monsieur Roussillon naturally understood that all this stir and crowding to see was but another demonstration of his personal popularity. He bowed and waved a vast hand. But the master of ceremonies called loudly for the dancers to take their places. Oncle Jason attacked his fiddle again with startling energy. Those who were not to dance formed a compact double line around the wall, the shorter ones in front, the taller in the rear. And what a scene it was! But no person present regarded it as in any way strange or especially picturesque, save as to the gown of Alice, which was now floating and whirling in time to Oncle Jason's mad music. The people outside the house cheerfully awaited their turn to go in, while an equal number went forth to chat and sing around the fires. Beverley was in a young man's seventh heaven. The angels formed a choir circling around his heart, and their song brimmed his universe from horizon to horizon. When he called at Roussillon Place, and Alice appeared so beautifully and becomingly robed, it was another memorable surprise. She flashed a new and subtly stimulating light upon him. The old gown, rich in subdued splendor of lace and brocade, was ornamented at the throat with a heavy band of pearls, just above which could be seen a trace of the gold chain that supported her portrait locket. There, too, with a not unbecoming gleam of barbaric colors, shone the string of porcupine beads to which the Indian charm stone hidden in her bosom was attached. It all harmonized with the time, the place, the atmosphere. Anywhere else it would have been preposterous as a decorative presentment, but here, in this little nook where the coureurs de bois, the half-breeds, the traders, and the missionaries had founded a centre of assembly, it was the best possible expression in the life so formed at haphazard, and so controlled by the coarsest and narrowest influences. To Fitzhugh Beverley of Beverley Hall the picture conveyed immediately a sweet and pervading influence. Alice looked superbly tall, stately, and self-possessed in her transforming costume, a woman of full stature, her countenance gravely demure yet reserving near the surface the playful dimples and mischievous smiles so characteristic of her more usual manner. A sudden mood of the variam et mutabili semper famina had led her to wear the dress, and the mood still illuminated her. Beverley stood before her frankly looking and admiring. The underglow in her cheeks deepened and spread over her perfect throat. Her eyes met his a second, then shyly avoided him. He hardly could have been sure which was master, her serenity or her girlish delight in being attractively dressed. But there could be no doubt as to her self-possession, for saving the pretty blush under his almost rude gaze of admiration, she bore herself as firmly as any fine lady he remembered. They walked together to the river house, she daintily holding up her skirts, under the insistent verbal direction of Madame Roussillon, and at the same time keeping a light, strangely satisfying touch on his arm. When they entered the room there was no way for Beverley to escape full consciousness of the excitement they aroused. But Monsieur Roussillon's assumption broke the force of what would have otherwise been extremely embarrassing. "It is encouraging, very encouraging," murmured the big man to Beverley in the midst of the staring and scrambling and craning of necks, "to have my people admire and love me so. It goes to the middle of my heart." And again he bowed and waved his hand with an all-including gesture, while he swept his eyes over the crowd. Alice and Beverley were soon in the whirl of the dance, forgetful of everything but an exhilaration stirred to its utmost by Oncle Jason's music. A side remark here may be of interest to those readers who enjoy the dream that on some fortunate day they will invade a lonely nook, where amid dust and cobwebs, neglected because unrecognized, reposes a masterpiece of Stradivari, or some other great fiddle maker. Oncle Jason knew nothing whatever about old violins. He was a natural musician, that was all, and flung himself upon his fiddle with the same passionate abandon that characterizes a healthy boy's assault when a plum pudding is at his mercy. But his fiddle was a Carlo Bergonzi. And now let the search be renewed, for the precious instrument was certainly still in Vincennes as late as 1819, and there is a vague tradition that Governor Whitcomb played on it not long before he died. The mark by which it may be identified is the single word Jason, cut in the back of its neck by Oncle Jason himself. When their dance was ended, Alice and Beverley followed the others of their set out into the open air, while a fresh stream of eager dancers poured in. Beverley insisted upon wrapping Alice in her mantle of unlined beaver skin against the searching winter breath. They did not go to the fire, but walked back and forth, chatting until their turn to dance should come again, pausing frequently to exchange pleasantries with some of the people. Curiously enough, both of them had forgotten the fact that other young men would be sure to ask Alice for a dance, and that more than one pretty Creole lass was rightfully expecting a giddy turn with the stalwart and handsome Lieutenant Beverley. René de Ronville before long broke rudely into their selfish dream and led Alice into the house. This reminded Beverley of his social duty, wherefore seeing little Adrienne Boursier he made a rush and secured her at a swoop from the midst of a scrambling circle of mutually hindered young men. "Allons, ma petite!" he cried, quite in the gay tone of the occasion, and swung her lightly along with him. It was like an eagle dancing with a linnet, or a giant with a fairy, when the big lieutenant led out La Petite Adrienne, as everybody called her. The honour of Beverley's attention sat unappreciated on Adrienne's mind, for all her thoughts went with her eyes toward René and Alice. Nor was Beverley so absorbed in his partner's behalf that he ever for a moment willingly lost sight of the floating buff gown, the shining brown hair, and the beautiful face, which formed, indeed, the centre of attraction for all eyes. Father Beret was present, sharing heartily in the merriment of his flock. Voices greeted him on all sides with intonations of tender respect. The rudest man there was loyal to the kind-hearted priest, and would as soon have thought of shooting him as of giving him any but the most reverent attention.
It is to be noted, however, that their understanding of reverence included great freedom and levity not especially ecclesiastical in its nature. Father Beret understood the conditions around him, and had the genius to know what not to hear, what not to see; but he never failed when a good word or a fatherly touch with his hand seemed worth trying on a sheep that appeared to be straying dangerously far from the fold. Upon an occasion like this dance at the river house, he was no less the faithful priest because of his genial sympathy with the happiness of the young people who looked to him for spiritual guidance. It was some time before Beverley could again secure Alice for a dance, and he found it annoying him atrociously to see her smile sweetly on some buckskin-clad lout who looked like an Indian and danced like a Parisian. He did not greatly enjoy most of his partners; they could not appeal to any side of his nature just then. Not that he had at all times stood too much on his aristocratic traditions, or lacked the virile straits common to vigorous and worldly-minded men, but the contrast between Alice and the other girls present was somehow an absolute bar to a democratic freedom of the sort demanded by the occasion. He met Father Beret and passed a few pleasant words with him. "They have honoured your flag, my son, I am glad to see," the priest said, pointing with a smile to where in one corner the banner that bore Alice's name was effectively draped. Beverley had not noticed it before, and when he presently got possession of Alice he asked her to tell him the story of how she planted it on the fort, although he had heard it to the last detail from Father Beret just a moment ago. They stood together under its folds while she naively sketched the scene for him, even down to her picturesquely disagreeable interview with Longhair, mention of whom led up to the story of the Indian's race with the stolen Dame Jeanne of brandy under his arm on that memorable night, and the subsequent services performed for him by Father Beret and her, after she and Jean had found him in the mud beyond the river. The dancing went on at a furious pace while they stood there. Now and again a youth came to claim her, but she said she was tired, and begged to rest awhile, smiling so graciously upon each one that his rebuff thrilled him, as if it had been the most flattering gift of tender partiality, while at the same time he suspected that it was all for Beverley. Helm, in his most jovial mood, was circulating freely among those who formed the periphery of the dancing area. He even ventured a few clumsy capers and a cotillion with Madame Coderre for a partner. She danced well, but he, as someone remarked, stumbled all over himself. There was but one thing to mar the evening's pleasure: some of the men drank too much, and grew boisterous. A quarrel ended in a noisy but harmless fight near one of the fires. Monsieur Roussillon rushed to the spot, seized the combatants, tussled them playfully as if they had been children, rubbed their heads together, laughed stormily, and so restored the equilibrium of temper. It was late when fathers and mothers in the company began to suggest adjournment. Oncle Jason's elbow was tired, and the enthusiasm generated by his unrecognized Bergonzi became fitful, while the relaxing crowd rapidly encroached upon the space set apart for the dancers. In the open lamps suspended here and there the oil was running low, and the rag wicks sputtered and winked with their yellow flames. "Well," said Monsieur Roussillon, coming to where Alice and Beverley stood insulated and isolated by their great delight in each other's company, "it's time to go home." Beverley looked at his watch. It was 2:45. Alice also looked at the watch, and saw engraved and enamelled on its massive case the Beverley crest, but she did not know what it meant. There was something of the sort in the back of her locket, she remembered with satisfaction. Just then there was a peculiar stir in the flagging crowd. Some one had arrived, a coureur de bois from the north. Where was the commandant? The coureur had something important for him. Beverley heard a remark in a startled voice about the English getting ready for a descent upon the Wabash Valley. This broke the charm which thralled him and sent through his nerves the bracing shock that only a soldier can feel when a hint of coming battle reaches him. Alice saw the flash in his face. "Where is Captain Helm? I must see him immediately." "Excuse me," he said abruptly, turning away and looking over the heads of the people. "Yonder he is. I must go to him." The coureur de bois, Adolphe Dutremble by name, was just from the head waters of the Wabash. He was speaking to Helm when Beverley came up. Monsieur Roussillon followed close upon the lieutenant's heels, as eager as he to know what the message amounted to; but Helm took the coureur aside, motioning Beverley to join them. Monsieur Roussillon included himself in the conference. After all, it was but the gossip of savages that Dutremble communicated. Still, the purport was startling in the extreme. Governor Hamilton, so the story ran, had been organizing a large force. He was probably now on his way to the portage of the Wabash with a flotilla of bateaux, some companies of disciplined soldiers, artillery, and a strong body of Indians. Helm listened attentively to Dutrempe's lively sketch, then cross-questioned him with laconic directness. "Send Mr. Jason to me," he said to Monsieur Roussillon, as if speaking to a servant. The master Frenchman went promptly, recognizing Captain Helm's right to command, and sympathizing with his unpleasant military predicament if the news should prove true. Oncle Jason came in a minute, his fiddle and bow clamped under his arm, to receive a verbal commission, which sent him with some scouts of his own choosing forthwith to the Wabash portage, or far enough to ascertain what the English commander was doing. After the conference Beverly made haste to join Alice, but he found that she had gone home. "One hell of a fix we'll be in if Hamilton comes down here with a good force," said Helm. Beverly felt like retorting that a little forethought, zeal, and preparation might have lessened the prospective gloom. He had been troubled all the time about Helm's utter lack of military precaution. True, there was very little material out of which that optimistic officer could have formed a body of resistance against the army probably at Hamilton's command. But Beverly was young, energetic, bellicose, and to him everything seemed possible. He believed in vigilance, discipline, activity, dash. He had a great faith in the efficacy of enthusiasm. "We must organize these Frenchmen," he said. "They will make good fighters, if we can once get them to act as a body. There's no time to be lost. But we have time enough in which to do a great deal before Hamilton can arrive, if we go at it in earnest." "Your theory is excellent, Lieutenant, but the practice of it won't be worth a damn," Helm replied with perfect good nature. "I'd like to see you organize these parley-voos. There ain't a dozen of 'em that wouldn't accept the English with open arms. I know 'em. They're good-hearted, polite, and all that. They'll hurrah for the flag. That's easy enough. But put 'em to the test, and they'll join in with the strongest side, see if they don't. Of course there are a few exceptions. There's Jason, he's all right, and I have faith in Bosseron and Legrasse and young Ronville." "Roussillon," Beverly began. "Is much of a blowhard," Helm interrupted with a laugh. "Barks loud, but his biting disposition is probably not vicious." "He and Father Beret control the whole population, at all events," said Beverly. "Yes, and such a population." While joining in Captain Helm's laugh at the expense of Vincennes, Beverly took leave to indulge a mental reservation in favor of Alice. He could not bear to class her with the crowd of noisy, thoughtless, mercurial beings whom he heard still singing gay snatches and calling to one another from distance to distance, as they strolled homeward in groups and pairs. Nor could the impending danger of an enforced surrender to the English and Indians drive from his mind her beautiful image, while he lay for the rest of the night between sleeping and waking on his primitive bed, alternately hearing over again her every phrase and laugh, and striving to formulate some definite plan for defending the town and fort. His heart was full of her. She had surprised his nature and filled it as with a wonderful haunting song. His youth, his imagination, all that was fresh and spontaneously gentle and natural in him was flooded with the magnetic splendor of her beauty. And yet, in his pride, and it was not a false pride but rather a noble regard for his birthright, he vaguely realized how far she was from him, how impossible. End of chapter 7.
Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and click on the bell to turn on notifications.